Chapter 10. In a few minutes the three hunters were before a crackling fire. The captain and the reporter were there. Pencroft looked from one to the other, his capybara in his hand, without saying a word. "Well, yes, my brave fellow," cried the reporter. "Fire, real fire, which will roast this splendid pig perfectly, and we will have a feast soon." "But who lighted it?" asked Pencroft. "The sun." Gideon Spilett was quite right in his reply. It was the sun which had furnished the heat which so astonished Pencroft. The sailor could scarcely believe his eyes, and he was so amazed that he did not think of questioning the engineer. "Had you a burning glass, sir?" asked Herbert of Harding. "No, my boy," replied he, "but I made one," and he showed the apparatus which served for a burning glass. It was simply two glasses, which he had taken from his own and the reporter's watches, having filled them with water and rendered their edges adhesive. By means of a little clay, he thus fabricated a regular burning glass, which, concentrating the solar rays on some very dry moss, soon caused it to blaze. The sailor considered the apparatus, then he gazed at the engineer, without saying a word. Only a look plainly expressed his opinion that if Cyrus Harding was not a magician, he was certainly no ordinary man. Last speech returned to him, and he cried, "Note that, Mr. Spilett. Note that down on your paper." "It is noted," replied the reporter. Then, Neb helping him, the seaman arranged the spit, and the capybara, properly cleaned, was soon roasting like a suckling pig before a clear, crackling fire. The chimneys had again become more habitable, not only because the passages were warmed by the fire, but because the partitions of wood and mud had been re-established. It was evident that the engineer and his companions had employed their day well. Cyrus Harding had almost entirely recovered his strength, and had proved it by climbing to the upper plateau. From this point his eye, accustomed to estimate heights and distances, was fixed for a long time on the cone, the summit of which he wished to reach the next day. The mountain, situated about 6 miles to the northwest, appeared to him to measure 500 feet above the level of the sea. Consequently, the gaze of an observer posted on its summit would extend over a radius of at least 50 miles. Therefore it was probable that Harding could easily solve the question of island or continent, to which he attached so much importance. They supped capitally. The flesh of the capybara was declared excellent. The sargassum and the almonds of the stone pine completed the repast, during which the engineer spoke little. He was preoccupied with projects for the next day. Once or twice Pencroft gave forth some ideas upon what it would be best to do, but Cyrus Harding, who was evidently of a methodical mind, only shook his head without uttering a word. "To-morrow," he repeated, "we shall know what we have to depend upon, and we will act accordingly." The meal ended, fresh armfuls of wood were thrown on the fire, and the inhabitants of the chimneys, including the faithful Top, were soon buried in a deep sleep. No incident disturbed this peaceful night, and the next day, the 29th of March, fresh and active they awoke, ready to undertake the excursion which must determine their fate. All was ready for the start. The remains of the capybara would be enough to sustain Harding and his companions for at least 24 hours. Besides, they hoped to find more food on the way, as the glasses had been returned to the watches of the engineer and reporter. Pencroft burned a little linen to serve as tinder. As to flint, that would not be wanting in these regions of plutonic origin. It was 7:30 in the morning when the explorers, armed with sticks, left the chimneys. Following Pencroft's advice, it appeared best to take the road already traversed through the forest, and to return by another route. It was also the most direct way to reach the mountain. They turned the south angle and followed the left bank of the river, which was abandoned at the point where it formed an elbow towards the southwest. The path, already trodden under the evergreen trees, was found, and at 9 o'clock Cyrus Harding and his companions had reached the western border of the forest. The ground, till then, very little undulated, boggy at first, dry and sandy afterwards, had a gentle slope, which ascended from the shore towards the interior of the country. A few very timid animals were seen under the forest trees. Top quickly started them, but his master soon called him back, for the time had not come to commence hunting. That would be attended to later. The engineer was not a man who would allow himself to be diverted from his fixed idea. It may evening have been said that he did not observe the country at all, either in its configuration or in its natural productions, his great aim being to climb the mountain before him, and therefore straight towards it he went. At 10 o'clock a halt of a few minutes was made. On leaving the forest, the mountain system of the country appeared before the explorers. The mountain was composed of two cones. The first, truncated at a height of about 2,500 feet, was sustained by buttresses, which appeared to branch out like the talons of an immense claw set on the ground. Between these were narrow valleys, bristling with trees, the last clumps of which rose to the top of the lowest cone. There appeared to be less vegetation on that side of the mountain which was exposed to the northeast, and deep fissures could be seen which, no doubt, were water-courses. On the first cone rested a second, slightly rounded, and placed a little on one side, like a great round hat cocked over the ear. A Scotchman would have said his bonnet was a thocht agi. It appeared formed of bare earth, here and there pierced by reddish rocks. They wished to reach the second cone, and proceeding along the ridge of the spurs seemed to be the best way by which to gain it. We are on volcanic ground, Cyrus Harding had said, and his companions, following him, began to ascend by degrees on the back of a spur, which, by a winding and consequently more accessible path, joined the first plateau. The ground had evidently been convulsed by subterranean force. Here and there stray blocks, numerous debris of basalt and pumice stone, were met with. In isolated groups rose fir trees, which, some 100 feet lower at the bottom of the narrow gorges, formed massive shades almost impenetrable to the sun's rays. During the first part of the ascent, Herbert remarked on the footprints, which indicated the recent passage of large animals. "Perhaps these beasts will not let us pass by willingly," said Pencroft. "Well," replied the reporter, who had already hunted the tiger in India and the lion in Africa, "we shall soon learn how successfully to encounter them. But in the meantime we must be upon our guard." They ascended but slowly. The distance, increased by detours and obstacles which could not be surmounted directly, was long. Sometimes, too, the ground suddenly fell, and they found themselves on the edge of a deep chasm which they had to go round. Thus, in retracing their steps so as to find some practicable path, much time was employed and fatigue undergone for nothing. At 12 o'clock, when the small band of adventurers halted for breakfast at the foot of a large group of firs, near a little stream which fell in cascades, they found themselves still halfway from the first plateau, which most probably they would not reach till nightfall. From this point the view of the sea was much extended, but on the right the high promontory prevented their seeing whether there was land beyond it. On the left, the sight extended several miles to the north, but on the northwest, at the point occupied by the explorers, it was cut short by the ridge of a fantastically shaped spur, which formed a powerful support of the central cone. At 1 o'clock the ascent was continued. They slanted more towards the southwest and again entered among thick bushes. There, under the shade of the trees, fluttered several couples of gallinaceae belonging to the pheasant species. They were tragopans, ornamented by a pendant skin, which hangs over their throats, and by two small, round horns planted behind the eyes. Among these birds, which were about the size of a fowl, the female was uniformly brown, while the male was gorgeous in his red plumage, decorated with white spots. Gideon Spilett, with a stone, cleverly and vigorously thrown, killed one of these tragopans, on which Pencroft, made hungry by the fresh air, had cast greedy eyes. After leaving the region of bushes, the party, assisted by resting on each other's shoulders, climbed for about 100 feet up a steep acclivity and reached a level place, with very few trees, where the soil appeared volcanic. It was necessary to ascend by zigzags to make the slope more easy, for it was very steep, and the footing being exceedingly precarious required the greatest caution. Neb and Herbert took the lead, Pencroft the rear, the captain and the reporter between them. The animals which frequented these heights, and there were numerous traces of them, must necessarily belong to those races of sure foot and supple spine, chamois or goat. Several were seen, but this was not the name Pencroft gave them, for all of a sudden sheep, he shouted. All stopped about 50 feet from half a dozen animals of a large size, with strong horns bent back and flattened towards the point, with a woolly fleece hidden under long silky hair of a tawny color. They were not ordinary sheep, but a species usually found in the mountainous regions of the temperate zone, to which Herbert gave the name of the musmen. "Have they legs and chops?" asked the sailor. "Yes," replied Herbert. "Well, then, they are sheep," said Pencroft. The animals, motionless among the blocks of basalt, gazed with an astonished eye, as if they saw human bipeds for the first time. Then, their fears suddenly aroused, they disappeared, bounding over the rocks. "Goodbye, till we meet again," cried Pencroft, as he watched them, in such a comical tone that Cyrus Harding, Gideon Spilett, Herbert, and Neb could not help laughing. The ascent was continued. Here and there were traces of lava, sulfur. Springs sometimes stopped their way, and they had to go round them. In some places the sulfur had formed crystals among other substances, such as whitish cinders made of an infinity of little feldspar crystals. In approaching the first plateau formed by the truncating of the lower cone, the difficulties of the ascent were very great. Towards 4 o'clock the extreme zone of the trees had been passed. There only remained here and there a few twisted, stunted pines, which must have had a hard life in resisting at this altitude the high winds from the open sea. Happily for the engineer and his companions the weather was beautiful, the atmosphere tranquil, for a high breeze at an elevation of 3,000 feet would have hindered their proceedings. The purity of the sky at the zenith was felt through the transparent air. A perfect calm reigned around them. They could not see the sun, then hid by the vast screen of the upper cone, which masked the half-horizon of the west, and whose enormous shadow stretching to the shore increased as the radiant luminary sank in its diurnal course. Vapor, mist rather than clouds, began to appear in the east and assume all the prismatic colors under the influence of the solar rays. 500 feet only separated the explorers from the plateau, which they wished to reach so as to establish there an encampment for the night. But these 500 feet were increased to more than 2 miles by the zigzags which they had to describe. The soil, as it were, slid under their feet. The slope often presented such an angle that they slipped when the stones worn by the air did not give a sufficient support. Evening came on by degrees, and it was almost night when Cyrus Harding and his companions, much fatigued by an ascent of 7 hours, arrived at the plateau of the first cone. It was then necessary to prepare an encampment and to restore their strength by eating first and sleeping afterwards. This second stage of the mountain rose on a base of rocks, among which it would be easy to find a retreat. Fuel was not abundant. However, a fire could be made by means of the moss and dry brushwood which covered certain parts of the plateau. While the sailor was preparing his hearth with stones, which he put to this use, Neb and Herbert occupied themselves with getting a supply of fuel. They soon returned with a load of brushwood. The steel was struck, the burnt linen caught the sparks of flint, and under Neb's breath, a crackling fire showed itself in a few minutes under the shelter of the rocks. Their object in lighting a fire was only to enable them to withstand the cold temperature of the night, as it was not employed in cooking the bird, which Neb kept for the next day. The remains of the capybara and some dozens of the stone pine almonds formed their supper. It was not 6:30 when all was finished. Cyrus Harding then thought of exploring in the half-light the large, circular layer which supported the upper cone of the mountain. Before taking any rest, he wished to know if it was possible to get round the base of the cone in the case of its sides being too steep and its summit being inaccessible. This question preoccupied him, for it was possible that from the way the hat inclined, that is to say, towards the north, the plateau was not practicable. Also, if the summit of the mountain could not be reached on one side, and if, on the other, they could not get round the base of the cone, it would be impossible to survey the western part of the country, and their object in making the ascent would, in part, be altogether unattained. The engineer, accordingly, regardless of fatigue, leaving Pencroft and Neb to arrange the beds and Gideon Spilett to note the incidents of the day, began to follow the edge of the plateau, going towards the north. Herbert accompanied him. The night was beautiful and still, the darkness was not yet deep. Cyrus Harding and the boy walked near each other, without speaking. In some places the plateau opened before them, and they passed without hindrance. In others, obstructed by rocks, there was only a narrow path, in which two persons could not walk abreast. After a walk of 20 minutes, Cyrus Harding and Herbert were obliged to stop. From this point, the slope of the two cones became one. No shoulder here separated the two parts of the mountain. The slope being inclined almost 70 degrees, the path became impracticable. But if the engineer and the boy were obliged to give up thoughts of following a circular direction, in return an opportunity was given for ascending the cone. In fact, before them opened a deep hollow. It was the rugged mouth of the crater, by which the eruptive liquid matter had escaped at the periods when the volcano was still in activity. Hardened lava and crusted scoria formed a sort of natural staircase of large steps, which would greatly facilitate the ascent to the summit of the mountain. Harding took all this in at a glance, and without hesitating, followed by the lad, he entered the enormous chasm in the amid of an increasing obscurity. There was still a height of 1,000 feet to overcome. Would the interior acclivities of the crater be practicable? It would soon be seen. The persevering engineer resolved to continue his ascent until he was stopped. Happily these acclivities wound up the interior of the volcano and favored their ascent. As to the volcano itself, it could not be doubted that it was completely extinct. No smoke escaped from its sides, not a flame could be seen in the dark hollows, not a roar, not a mutter, no trembling evening issued from this black well, which perhaps reached far into the bowels of the earth. The atmosphere inside the crater was filled with no sulphurous vapor. It was more than the sleep of a volcano. It was its complete extinction. Cyrus Harding's attempt would succeed. Little by little, Herbert and he, climbing up the sides of the interior, saw the crater widen above their heads. The radius of this circular portion of the sky, framed by the edge of the cone, increased obviously. At each step, as it were, that the explorers made, fresh stars entered the field of their vision. The magnificent constellations of the southern sky shone resplendently. At the zenith glittered the splendid Antares and the Scorpion, and not far was Alpha Centauri, which is believed to be the nearest star to the terrestrial globe. Then, as the crater widened, appeared foam out of the fish, the southern triangle, and lastly, nearly at the Antarctic pole, the glittering Southern Cross, which replaces the polar star of the northern hemisphere. It was nearly 8 o'clock when Cyrus Harding and Herbert set foot on the highest ridge of the mountain at the summit of the cone. It was then perfectly dark, and their gaze could not extend over a radius of 2 miles. Did the sea surround this unknown land, or was it connected in the west with some continent of the Pacific? It could not yet be made out. Towards the west, a cloudy belt, clearly visible at the horizon, increased the gloom, and the eye could not discover if the sky and water were blended together in the same circular line. But at one point of the horizon a vague light suddenly appeared, which descended slowly in proportion as the cloud mounted to the zenith. It was the slender crescent moon, already almost disappearing, but its light was sufficient to show clearly the horizontal line, then detached from the cloud, and the engineer could see its reflection trembling for an instant on a liquid surface. Chapter 11. Half an hour later, Cyrus Harding and Herbert had returned to the encampment. The engineer merely told his companions that the land upon which fate had thrown them was an island, and that the next day they would consult. Then each settled himself as well as he could to sleep, and in that rocky hole, at a height of 2,500 feet above the level of the sea, through a peaceful night, the islanders enjoyed profound repose. The next day, the 30th of March, after a hasty breakfast, which consisted solely of the roasted tragopan, the engineer wished to climb again to the summit of the volcano, so as more attentively to survey the island upon which he and his companions were imprisoned for life. Perhaps, should the island be situated at a great distance from any land, or if it was out of the course of vessels which visited the archipelagos of the Pacific Ocean. This time his companions followed him in the new exploration. They also wished to see the island, on the productions of which they must depend for the supply of all their wants. It was about 7 o'clock in the morning when Cyrus Harding, Herbert, Pencroft, Gideon Spilett, and Neb quitted the encampment. No one appeared to be anxious about their situation. They had faith in themselves, doubtless, but it must be observed that the basis of this faith was not the same with Harding as with his companions. The engineer had confidence because he felt capable of extorting from this wild country everything necessary for the life of himself and his companions. The latter feared nothing, just because Cyrus Harding was with them. Pencroft especially, since the incident of the relighted fire, would not have despaired for an instant, even if he was on a bare rock, if the engineer was with him on the rock. "Pshaw," said he, "we left Richmond without permission from the authorities. It will be hard if we don't manage to get away some day or other from a place where certainly no one will detain us." Cyrus Harding followed the same road as the evening before. They went round the cone by the plateau, which formed the shoulder to the mouth of the enormous chasm. The weather was magnificent. The sun rose in a pure sky and flooded with his rays all the eastern side of the mountain. The crater was reached. It was just what the engineer had made it out to be in the dark, that is to say, a vast funnel which extended, widening, to a height of 1,000 feet above the plateau. Below the chasm, large, thick streaks of lava wound over the sides of the mountain, and thus marked the course of the eruptive matter to the lower valleys which furrowed the northern part of the island. The interior of the crater, whose inclination did not exceed 35 to 40 degrees, presented no difficulties nor obstacles to the ascent. Traces of very ancient lava were noticed, which probably had overflowed the summit of the cone before this lateral chasm had opened a new way to it. As to the volcanic chimney which established a communication between the subterranean layers and the crater, its depth could not be calculated with the eye, for it was lost in obscurity, but there was no doubt as to the complete extinction of the volcano before 8 o'clock. Harding and his companions were assembled at the summit of the crater, on a conical mound, which swelled the northern edge. The sea everywhere, they cried, as if their lips could not restrain the words which made islanders of them. The sea, truly, formed an immense circular sheet of water all around them. Perhaps, on climbing again to the summit of the cone, Cyrus Harding had had a hope of discovering some coast, some island shore, which he had not been able to perceive in the dark the evening before. But nothing appeared on the farthest verge of the horizon, that is to say over a radius of more than 50 miles. No land in sight, not a sail. Over all this immense space the ocean alone was visible. The island occupied the center of a circumference which appeared to be infinite. The engineer and his companions, mute and motionless, surveyed for some minutes every point of the ocean, examining it to its most extreme limits. Evening Pencroft, who possessed a marvelous power of sight, saw nothing, and certainly if there had been land at the horizon, if it appeared only as an indistinct vapor, the sailor would undoubtedly have found it out, for nature had placed regular telescopes under his eyebrows. From the ocean their gaze returned to the island, which they commanded entirely, and the first question was put by Gideon Spilett in these terms: "About what size is this island?" Truly, it did not appear large in the amid of the immense ocean. Cyrus Harding reflected a few minutes. He attentively observed the perimeter of the island, taking into consideration the height at which he was placed. "Then, my friends," said he, "I do not think I am mistaken in giving to the shore of the island a circumference of more than 100 miles, and consequently an area that is difficult to estimate," replied the engineer, "for it is so uneven." If Cyrus Harding was not mistaken in his calculation, the island had almost the extent of Malta or Zante in the Mediterranean, but it was at the same time much more irregular and less rich in capes, promontories, points, bays, or creeks. Its strange form caught the eye, and when Gideon Spilett, on the engineer's advice, had drawn the outline, they found that it resembled some fantastic animal, a monstrous leviathan, which lay sleeping on the surface of the Pacific. This was in fact the exact shape of the island, which it is of consequence to know, and a tolerably correct map of it was immediately drawn by the reporter. The east part of the shore, where the castaways had landed, formed a wide bay terminated by a sharp cape, which had been concealed by a high point from Pencroft on his first exploration. At the northeast 2 other capes closed the bay, and between them ran a narrow gulf, which looked like the half-opened jaws of a formidable dogfish. From the northeast to the southwest the coast was rounded, like the flattened cranium of an animal, rising again, forming a sort of protuberance which did not give any particular shape to this part of the island, of which the center was occupied by the volcano. From this point the shore ran pretty regularly north and south, broken at 2/3 of its perimeter by a narrow creek, from which it ended in a long tail, similar to the caudal appendage of a gigantic alligator. This tail formed a regular peninsula, which stretched more than 30 miles into the sea. Reckoning from the cape southeast of the island already mentioned, it curled round, making an open roadstead which marked out the lower shore of this strangely formed land. At the narrowest part, that is to say between the Chimneys and the creek, on the western shore, which corresponded to it in latitude, the island only measured 10 miles, but its greatest length, from the jaws at the northeast to the extremity of the tail of the southwest, was not less than 30 miles. As to the interior of the island, its general aspect was this: very woody throughout the southern part from the mountain to the shore, and arid and sandy in the northern part. Between the volcano and the east coast, Cyrus Harding and his companions were surprised to see a lake bordered with green trees, the existence of which they had not suspected. Seen from this height, The lake appeared to be on the same level as the ocean, but on reflection, the engineer explained to his companions that the altitude of this little sheet of water must be about 300 feet, because the plateau, which was its basin, was but a prolongation of the coast. "Is it a freshwater lake?" asked Pencroft. "Certainly," replied the engineer, "for it must be fed by the water which flows from the mountain." "I see a little river which runs into it," said Herbert, pointing out a narrow stream, which evidently took its source somewhere in the west. "Yes," said Harding, "and since this stream feeds the lake most probably on the side near the sea, there is an outlet by which the surplus water escapes. We shall see that on our return. This little winding watercourse, and the river already mentioned, constituted the water system, at least such as it was displayed to the eyes of the explorers. However, it was possible that under the masses of trees which covered 2/3 of the island, forming an immense forest, other rivers ran towards the sea. It may even be inferred that such was the case, so rich did this region appear in the most magnificent specimens of the flora of the temperate zones. There was no indication of running water in the north, though perhaps there may be stagnant water among the marshes in the northeast, but that was all, in addition to the downs, sand, and aridity which contrasted so strongly with the luxuriant vegetation of the rest of the island. The volcano did not occupy the central part. It rose, on the contrary, in the northwestern region, and seemed to mark the boundary of the two zones. At the southwest, at the south, and the southeast, the first part of the spurs were hidden under masses of verdure. At the north, on the contrary, one could follow their ramifications, which died away on the sandy plains. It was on this side that, at the time when the mountain was in a state of eruption, the discharge had worn away a passage, and a large heap of lava had spread to the narrow jaw which formed the northeastern gulf. Cyrus Harding and his companions remained an hour at the top of the mountain. The island was displayed under their eyes like a plan in relief, with different tints: green for the forests, yellow for the sand, blue for the water. They viewed it in its tout ensemble. Nothing remained concealed but the ground hidden by verdure, the hollows of the valleys, and the interior of the volcanic chasms. One important question remained to be solved, and the answer would have a great effect upon the future of the castaways. Was the island inhabited? It was the reporter who put this question, to which after the close examination they had just made, the answer seemed to be in the negative. Nowhere could the work of a human hand be perceived. Not a group of huts, not a solitary cabin, not a fishery on the shore. No smoke curling in the air betrayed the presence of man. It is true, a distance of nearly 30 miles separated the observers from the extreme points, that is, of the tail, which extended to the southwest, and it would have been difficult, even to Pencroft's eyes, to discover a habitation there. Neither could the curtain of verdure, which covered 3/4 of the island, be raised to see if it did not shelter some straggling village. But in general the islanders live on the shores of the narrow spaces which emerge above the waters of the Pacific, and this shore appeared to be an absolute desert. Until a more complete exploration, it may be admitted that the island was uninhabited, but was it frequented, at least occasionally, by the natives of neighboring islands? It was difficult to reply to this question. No land appeared within a radius of 50 miles, but 50 miles could be easily crossed, either by Malay proas or by the large Polynesian canoes. Everything depended on the position of the island, of its isolation in the Pacific, or of its proximity to archipelagos. Would Cyrus Harding be able to find out their latitude and longitude without instruments? It would be difficult. Since he was in doubt, it was best to take precautions against a possible descent of neighboring natives. The exploration of the island was finished, its shape determined, its features made out, its extent calculated, the water and mountain systems ascertained. The disposition of the forests and plains had been marked in a general way on the reporter's plan. They had now only to descend the mountain slopes again and explore the soil in the triple point of view of its mineral, vegetable, and animal resources. But before giving his companions the signal for departure, Cyrus Harding said to them in a calm, grave voice, "Here, my friends, is the small corner of land upon which the hand of the Almighty has thrown us. We are going to live here a long time, perhaps. Perhaps, too, unexpected help will arrive if some ship passes. By chance, I say by chance, because this is an unimportant island. There is not even a port in which ships could anchor, and it is to be feared that it is situated out of the route usually followed, that is to say, too much to the south for the ships which frequent the archipelagos of the Pacific, and too much to the north for those which go to Australia by doubling Cape Horn. I wish to hide nothing of our position from you, and you are right, my dear Cyrus," replied the reporter with animation. "You have to deal with men. They have confidence in you, and you can depend upon them. Is it not so, my friends?" "I will obey you in everything, Captain," said Herbert, seizing the engineer's hand. "My master always and everywhere," cried Neb. "As for me," said the sailor, "if I ever grumble at work, my name's not Jack Pencroft, and if you like, Captain, we will make a little America of this island. We will build towns, we will establish railways, start telegraphs, and one fine day, when it is quite changed, quite put in order, and quite civilized, we will go and offer it to the government of the Union. Only, I ask one thing." "What is that?" said the reporter. "It is that we do not consider ourselves castaways, but colonists who have come here to settle." Harding could not help smiling, and the sailor's idea was adopted. He then thanked his companions and added that he would rely on their energy and on the aid of heaven. "Well, now let us set off to the Chimneys," cried Pencroft. "1 minute, my friends," said the engineer. "It seems to me it would be a good thing to give a name to this island as well as to the capes, promontories, and watercourses which we can see." "Very good," said the reporter. "In the future, that will simplify the instructions which we shall have to give and follow." "Truly," said the sailor, "already it is something to be able to say where one is going and where one has come from. At least, it looks like somewhere. The Chimneys, for example," said Herbert. "Exactly," replied Pencroft. "That name was the most convenient, and it came to me quite of myself. Shall we keep the name of the Chimneys for our first encampment, Captain?" "Yes, Pencroft, since you have so christened it." "Good. As for the others, that will be easy," returned the sailor, who was in high spirits. "Let us give them names, as the Robinsons did, whose story Herbert has often read to me. Providence Bay, Whale Point, Cape Disappointment, or, rather, the names of Captain Harding," said Herbert, "of Mr. Spilett, of Neb." "My name!" cried Neb, showing his sparkling white teeth. "Why not?" replied Pencroft. "Port Neb. That would do very well. And Cape Gideon." "I should prefer borrowing names from our country," said the reporter, "which would remind us of America." "Yes, for the principal ones," then said Cyrus Harding. "For those of the bays and seas, I admit it willingly. We may give to that vast bay on the east the name of Union Bay, for example, to that large hollow on the south, Washington Bay, to the mountain upon which we are standing, that of Mount Franklin, to that lake which is extended under our eyes, that of Lake Grant. Nothing could be better, my friends. These names will recall our country and those of the great citizens who have honored it. But for the rivers, gulfs, capes, and promontories which we perceive from the top of this mountain, rather let us choose names which will recall their particular shape. They will impress themselves better on our memory, and at the same time will be more practical. The shape of the island is so strange that we shall not be troubled to imagine what it resembles. As to the streams which we do not know as yet, in different parts of the forest which we shall explore later, the creeks, which afterwards will be discovered, we can christen them as we find them. What do you think, my friends? The engineer's proposal was unanimously agreed to by his companions. The island was spread out under their eyes like a map, and they had only to give names to all its angles and points. Gideon Spilett would write them down, and the geographical nomenclature of the island would be definitely adopted. First, they named the two bays and the mountain, Union Bay, Washington Bay, and Mount Franklin, as the engineer had suggested. Now, said the reporter, to this peninsula at the southwest of the island, I propose to give the name of Serpentine Peninsula and that of Reptile End to the bent tail which terminates it, for it is just like a reptile's tail. Adopted, said the engineer. Now, said Herbert, pointing to the other extremity of the island, let us call this gulf, which is so singularly like a pair of open jaws, Shark Gulf. Capital, cried Pencroft, and we can complete the resemblance by naming the two parts of the jaws Mandible Cape. But there are two capes, observed the reporter. Well, replied Pencroft, we can have North Mandible Cape and South Mandible Cape. They are inscribed, said Spilett. There is only the point at the southeastern extremity of the island to be named, said Pencroft. That is the extremity of Union Bay? Asked Herbert. Claw Cape, cried Neb directly, who also wished to be godfather to some part of his domain. In truth, Neb had found an excellent name, for this cape was very like the powerful claw of the fantastic animal which this singularly shaped island represented. Pencroft was delighted at the turn things had taken, and their imaginations soon gave to the river which furnished the settlers with drinking water and near which the balloon had thrown them the name of the Mercy, in true gratitude to Providence, to the islet upon which the castaways had first landed, the name of Safety Island, to the plateau which crowned the high granite precipice above the Chimneys, and from where the gaze could embrace the whole of the vast bay, the name of Prospect Heights. Lastly, all the masses of impenetrable wood which covered the Serpentine Peninsula were named the forests of the far west. The nomenclature of the visible and known parts of the island was thus finished, and later they would complete it as they made fresh discoveries. As to the points of the compass, the engineer had roughly fixed them by the height and position of the sun, which placed Union Bay and Prospect Heights to the east, but the next day, by taking the exact hour of the rising and setting of the sun, and by marking its position between this rising and setting, he reckoned to fix the north of the island exactly, for, in consequence of its situation in the southern hemisphere, the sun, at the precise moment of its culmination, passed in the north and not in the south, as in its apparent movement it seems to do to those places situated in the northern hemisphere. Everything was finished, and the settlers had only to descend Mount Franklin to return to the Chimneys, when Pencroft cried out, "Well, we are preciously stupid." "Why?" asked Gideon Spilett, who had closed his notebook and risen to depart. "Why, our island, we have forgotten to christen it." Herbert was going to propose to give it the engineer's name, and all his companions would have applauded him, when Cyrus Harding said simply, "Let us give it the name of a great citizen, my friend, of him who now struggles to defend the unity of the American Republic. Let us call it Lincoln Island." The engineer's proposal was replied to by 3 hurrahs, and that evening, before sleeping, the new colonists talked of their absent country. They spoke of the terrible war which stained it with blood. They could not doubt that the South would soon be subdued, and that the cause of the North, the cause of justice, would triumph. Thanks to Grant, thanks to Lincoln. Now this happened the 30th of March, 1865. Chapter 12. They now began the descent of the mountain, climbing down the crater. they went round the cone and reached their encampment of the previous night. Pencroft thought it must be breakfast time, and the watches of the reporter and engineer were therefore consulted to find out the hour. That of Gideon Spilett had been preserved from the sea water, as he had been thrown at once on the sand out of reach of the waves. It was an instrument of excellent quality, a perfect pocket chronometer, which the reporter had not forgotten to wind up carefully every day. As to the engineer's watch, it, of course, had stopped during the time which he had passed on the downs. The engineer now wound it up, and ascertaining by the height of the sun that it must be about 9 o'clock in the morning, he put his watch at that hour. No, my dear Spilett, wait. You have kept the Richmond time, have you not? Yes, Cyrus. Consequently, your watch is set by the meridian of that town, which is almost that of Washington? Undoubtedly. Very well, keep it thus. Content yourself with winding it up very exactly, but do not touch the hands. This may be of use to us. What will be the good of that? Thought the sailor. They ate, and so heartily, that the store of game and almonds was totally exhausted. But Pencroft was not at all uneasy. They would supply themselves on the way. Top, whose share had been very much to his taste, would know how to find some fresh game among the brushwood. Moreover, the sailor thought of simply asking the engineer to manufacture some powder and 1 or 2 fowling pieces. He supposed there would be no difficulty in that. On leaving the plateau, the captain proposed to his companions to return to the Chimneys by a new way. He wished to reconnoiter Lake Grant, so magnificently framed in trees. They therefore followed the crest of one of the spurs, between which the creek that supplied the lake probably had its source. In talking, the settlers already employed the names which they had just chosen, which singularly facilitated the exchange of their ideas. Herbert and Pencroft, the one young and the other very boyish, were enchanted, and while walking, the sailor said, "Hey, Herbert, how capital it sounds! It will be impossible to lose ourselves, my boy, since, whether we follow the way to Lake Grant, or whether we join the Mercy through the woods of the far west, we shall be certain to arrive at Prospect Heights, and, consequently, at Union Bay." It had been agreed that without forming a compact band, the settlers should not stray away from each other. It was very certain that the thick forests of the island were inhabited by dangerous animals, and it was prudent to be on their guard. In general, Pencroft, Herbert, and Neb walked first, preceded by Top, who poked his nose into every bush. The reporter and the engineer went together, Gideon Spilett ready to note every incident, the engineer silent for the most part, and only stepping aside to pick up one thing or another, a mineral or vegetable substance, which he put into his pocket without making any remark. "What can he be picking up?" muttered Pencroft. "I have looked in vain for anything that's worth the trouble of stooping for." Towards 10 o'clock the little band descended the last declivities of Mount Franklin. As yet the ground was scantily strewn with bushes and trees. They were walking over yellowish calcinated earth, forming a plain of nearly a mile long, which extended to the edge of the wood. Great blocks of that basalt, which, according to Biscoff, takes 350 millions of years to cool, strewed the plain, very confused in some places. However, there were here no traces of lava, which was spread more particularly over the northern slopes. Cyrus Harding expected to reach, without incident, the course of the creek, which he supposed flowed under the trees at the border of the plain, when he saw Herbert running hastily back, while Neb and the sailor were hiding behind the rocks. "What's the matter, my boy?" asked Spilett. "Smoke," replied Herbert. "We have seen smoke among the rocks 100 paces from us." "Men in this place," cried the reporter. "We must avoid showing ourselves before knowing with whom we have to deal," replied Cyrus Harding. "I trust that there are no natives on this island. I dread them more than anything else." Where is Top? Top is on before, and he doesn't bark. No, that is strange. However, we must try to call him back. In a few moments, the engineer, Gideon Spilett, and Herbert had rejoined their two companions, and like them, they kept out of sight behind the heaps of basalt. From there they clearly saw smoke of a yellowish color rising in the air. Top was recalled by a slight whistle from his master, and the latter, signing to his companions to wait for him, glided away among the rocks. The colonists, motionless, anxiously awaited the result of this exploration, when a shout from the engineer made them hasten forward. They soon joined him, and were at once struck with a disagreeable odor, which impregnated the atmosphere. The odor, easily recognized, was enough for the engineer to guess what the smoke was which at first, not without cause, had startled him. "This fire," said he, "or rather, this smoke is produced by nature alone. There is a sulphur spring there, which will cure all our sore throats." "Captain," cried Pencroft, "what a pity that I haven't got a cold." The settlers then directed their steps towards the place from which the smoke escaped. They there saw a sulphur spring which flowed abundantly between the rocks, and its waters discharged a strong sulphuric acid odor after having absorbed the oxygen of the air. Cyrus Harding, dipping in his hand, felt the water oily to the touch. He tasted it and found it rather sweet. As to its temperature, that he estimated at 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Herbert having asked on what he based this calculation, "It's quite simple, my boy," said he, "for, in plunging my hand into the water, I felt no sensation either of heat or cold. Therefore it has the same temperature as the human body, which is about 95 degrees. The sulphur spring not being of any actual use to the settlers, they proceeded towards the thick border of the forest, which began some 100 paces off. There, as they had conjectured, the waters of the stream flowed clear and limpid between high banks of red earth, the color of which betrayed the presence of oxide of iron. From this color, the name of Red Creek was immediately given to the watercourse. It was only a large stream, deep and clear, formed of the mountain water, which, half river, half torrent, here rippling peacefully over the sand, there falling against the rocks or dashing down in a cascade, ran towards the lake, over a distance of 1.5 miles, its breadth varying from 30 to 40 feet. Its waters were sweet, and it was supposed that those of the lake were so also. A fortunate circumstance, in the event of their finding on its borders a more suitable dwelling than the Chimneys. As to the trees, which some 100 feet downwards shaded the banks of the creek, they belonged, for the most part, to the species which abound in the temperate zone of America and Tasmania, and no longer to those coniferae observed in that portion of the island already explored, to some miles from Prospect Heights. At this time of the year, the commencement of the month of April, which represents the month of October in this hemisphere, that is the beginning of autumn, they were still in full leaf. They consisted principally of casuarinas and eucalypti, some of which next year would yield a sweet manna, similar to the manna of the East. Clumps of Australian cedars rose on the sloping banks, which were also covered with a high grass called tussock in New Holland, but the coconut, so abundant in the archipelagos of the Pacific, seemed to be wanting in the island, the latitude, doubtless, being too low. "What a pity," said Herbert, "such a useful tree, and which has such beautiful nuts." As to the birds, they swarmed among the scanty branches of the eucalypti and casuarinas, which did not hinder the display of their wings. Black, white, or gray cockatoos, paroquets, with plumage of all colors, kingfishers of a sparkling green and crowned with red, blue lories, and various other birds appeared on all sides, as through a prism, fluttering about and producing a deafening clamor. Suddenly, a strange concert of discordant voices resounded in the amid of a thicket. The settlers heard successively the song of birds, the cry of quadrupeds, and a sort of clacking which they may have believed to have escaped from the lips of a native. Neb and Herbert rushed towards the bush, forgetting evening the most elementary principles of prudence. Happily, they found there neither a formidable wild beast nor a dangerous native, but merely half a dozen mocking and singing birds known as mountain pheasants. A few skillful blows from a stick soon put an end to their concert and procured excellent food for the evening's dinner. Herbert also discovered some magnificent pigeons with bronzed wings, some superbly crested, others draped in green, like their congeners at Port Macquarie, but it was impossible to reach them or the crows and magpies which flew away in flocks. A charge of small shot would have made great slaughter among these birds, but the hunters were still limited to sticks and stones, and these primitive weapons proved very insufficient. Their insufficiency was still more clearly shown when a troop of quadrupeds, jumping, bounding, making leaps of 30 feet, regular, flying mammiferae, fled over the thickets so quickly and at such a height that one would have thought that they passed from one tree to another like squirrels. Kangaroos, cried Herbert. Are they good to eat? Asked Pencroft. Stewed, replied the reporter. Their flesh is equal to the best. Venison. Gideon Spilett had not finished this exciting sentence when the sailor, followed by Neb and Herbert, darted on the kangaroo's tracks. Cyrus Harding called them back in vain, but it was in vain too for the hunters to pursue such agile game, which went bounding away like balls. After a chase of 5 minutes, they lost their breath, and at the same time all sight of the creatures which disappeared in the wood. Top was not more successful than his masters. Captain, said Pencroft, when the engineer and the reporter had rejoined them. Captain, you see quite well we can't get on unless we make a few guns. Will that be possible? Perhaps, replied the engineer, but we will begin by first manufacturing some bows and arrows, and I don't doubt that you will become as clever in the use of them as the Australian hunters. Bows and arrows, said Pencroft scornfully. That's all very well for children. Don't be proud, friend Pencroft, replied the reporter. Bows and arrows were sufficient for centuries to stain the earth with blood. Powder is but a thing of yesterday, and war is as old as the human race, unhappily. Faith, that's true, Mr. Spilett, replied the sailor, and I always speak too quickly. You must excuse me. Meanwhile, Herbert, constant to his favorite science, natural history, reverted to the kangaroos, saying, besides, we had to deal just now with the species which is most difficult to catch. They were giants with long gray fur, but if I am not mistaken, there exist black and red kangaroos, rock kangaroos, and rat kangaroos, which are more easy to get hold of. It is reckoned that there are about a dozen species. Herbert, replied the sailor sententiously, there is only one species of kangaroos to me. That is kangaroo on the spit, and it's just the one we haven't got this evening. They could not help laughing at Master Pencroft's new classification. The honest sailor did not hide his regret at being reduced for dinner to the singing pheasants, but fortune once more showed itself obliging to him. In fact, Top, who felt that his interest was concerned, went and ferreted everywhere with an instinct doubled by a ferocious appetite. It was evening, probable that if some piece of game did fall into his clutches, none would be left for the hunters. If Top was hunting on his own account, but Neb watched him, and he did well. Towards 3 o'clock the dog disappeared in the brushwood, and gruntings showed that he was engaged in a struggle with some animal. Neb rushed after him, and soon saw Top eagerly devouring a quadruped, which 10 seconds later would have been past recognizing in Top's stomach. But fortunately the dog had fallen upon a brood, and besides the victim he was devouring 2 other rodents. The animals in question belonged to that order, lay strangled on the turf. Neb reappeared triumphantly, holding one of the rodents in each hand. Their size exceeded that of a rabbit, their hair was yellow mingled with green spots, and they had the merest rudiments of tails. The citizens of the Union were at no loss for the right name of these rodents. They were maras, a sort of adati, a little larger than their congeners of tropical countries, regular American rabbits, with long ears, jaws armed on each side with 5 molars, which distinguish the agati. "Hurrah!" cried Pencroft, "the roast has arrived, and now we can go home." The walk, interrupted for an instant, was resumed. The limpid waters of the Red Creek flowed under an arch of casuanas, banksias, and gigantic gum trees. Superb lilacs rose to a height of 20 feet. Other arborescent species, unknown to the young naturalist, bent over the stream, which could be heard murmuring beneath the bowers of verdure. Meanwhile the stream grew much wider, and Cyrus Harding supposed that they would soon reach its mouth. In fact, on emerging from beneath a thick clump of beautiful trees, it suddenly appeared before their eyes. The explorers had arrived on the western shore of Lake Grant. The place was well worth looking at. This extent of water, of a circumference of nearly 7 miles and an area of 250 acres, reposed in a border of diversified trees. Towards the east, through a curtain of verdure, picturesquely raised in some places, sparkled an horizon of sea. The lake was curved at the north, which contrasted with the sharp outline of its lower part. Numerous aquatic birds frequented the shores of this little Ontario, in which the 1,000 isles of its American namesake were represented by a rock which emerged from its surface some 100 feet from the southern shore. There lived in harmony several couples of kingfishers perched on a stone, grave, motionless, watching for fish. Then darting down, they plunged in with a sharp cry and reappeared with their prey in their beaks. On the shores and on the islets strutted wild ducks, pelicans, water hens, redbeaks, phyllodons, furnished with a tongue like a brush, and 1 or 2 specimens of the splendid menura, the tail of which expands gracefully like a lyre. As to the water of the lake, it was sweet, limpid, rather dark, and from certain bubblings and the concentric circles which crossed each other on the surface, it could not be doubted that it abounded in fish. "This lake is really beautiful," said Gideon Spilett. "We could live on its borders." "We will live there," replied Harding. The settlers, wishing to return to the Chimneys by the shortest way, descended towards the angle formed on the south by the junction of the lake's bank. It was not without difficulty that they broke a path through the thickets and brushwood which had never been put aside by the hand of men, and they thus went towards the shore so as to arrive at the north of Prospect Heights. 2 miles were cleared in this direction, and then, after they had passed the last curtain of trees, appeared the plateau, carpeted with thick turf, and beyond that the infinite sea. To return to the Chimneys, it was enough to cross the plateau obliquely for the space of a mile, and then to descend to the elbow formed by the first detour of the Mersey. But the engineer desired to know how and where the overplus of the water from the lake escaped, and the exploration was prolonged under the trees for a mile and a half towards the north. It was most probable that an overfall existed somewhere, and doubtless through a cleft in the granite. This lake was only, in short, an immense center basin, which was filled by degrees by the creek, and its waters must necessarily pass to the sea by some fall. If it was so, the engineer thought that it may perhaps be possible to utilize this fall and borrow its power, actually lost without profit to any one. They continued then to follow the shores of Lake Grant by climbing the plateau, but after having gone a mile in this direction, Cyrus Harding had not been able to discover the overfall, which, however, must exist somewhere. It was then 4:30. In order to prepare for dinner it was necessary that the settlers should return to their dwelling. The little band retraced their steps, therefore, and by the left bank of the Mersey, Cyrus Harding and his companions arrived at the Chimneys. The fire was lighted, and Neb and Pencroft, on whom the functions of cooks naturally devolved, to the one in his quality of negro, to the other in that of sailor, quickly prepared some broiled agouti, to which they did great justice. The repast at length terminated. At the moment when each one was about to give himself up to sleep, Cyrus Harding drew from his pocket little specimens of different sorts of minerals and just said, "My friends, this is iron mineral, this a pyrite, this is clay, this is lime, and this is coal. Nature gives us these things. It is our business to make a right use of them." Chapter 13. "Well, Captain, where are we going to begin?" asked Pencroft next morning of the engineer. "At the beginning," replied Cyrus Harding, and in fact the settlers were compelled to begin at the very beginning. They did not possess even the tools necessary for making tools, and they were not even in the condition of nature, who, having time, husbands her strength. They had no time, since they had to provide for the immediate wants of their existence, and though, profiting by acquired experience, they had nothing to invent, still they had everything to make. Their iron and their steel were as yet only in the state of minerals, their earthenware in the state of clay, their linen and their clothes in the state of textile material. It must be said, however, that the settlers were men in the complete and higher sense of the word. The engineer Harding could not have been seconded by more intelligent companions, nor with more devotion and zeal. He had tried them. He knew their abilities. Gideon Spilett, a talented reporter, having learned everything so as to be able to speak of everything, would contribute largely with his head and hands to the colonization of the island. He would not draw back from any task. A determined sportsman, he would make a business of what till then had only been a pleasure to him. Herbert, a gallant boy, already remarkably well informed in the natural sciences, would render greater service to the common cause. Neb was devotion personified. Clever, intelligent, indefatigable, robust, with iron health, he knew a little about the work of the forge, and could not fail to be very useful in the colony. As to Pencroft, he had sailed over every sea, a carpenter in the dockyards in Brooklyn, assistant tailor in the vessels of the state, gardener, cultivator, during his holidays, etc., and like all seamen, fit for anything, he knew how to do everything. It would have been difficult to unite 5 men, better fitted to struggle against fate, more certain to triumph over it. At the beginning, Cyrus Harding had said, "Now this beginning of which the engineer spoke was the construction of an apparatus which would serve to transform the natural substances. The part which heat plays in these transformations is known. Now fuel, wood or coal, was ready for immediate use. An oven must be built to use it." "What is this oven for?" asked Pencroft. "To make the pottery which we have need of," replied Harding. "And of what shall we make the oven?" "With bricks." "And the bricks?" "With clay. Let us start, my friends. To save trouble, we will establish our manufactory at the place of production. Neb will bring provisions, and there will be no lack of fire to cook the food." "No," replied the reporter, "but if there is a lack of food for want of instruments for the chase." "Ah, if we only had a knife!" cried the sailor. "Well?" asked Cyrus Harding. "Well, I would soon make a bow and arrows, and then there could be plenty of game in the larder." "Yes, a knife, a sharp blade," said the engineer, as if he was speaking to himself. At this moment his eyes fell upon Top, who was running about on the shore. Suddenly Harding's face became animated. "Top, here," said he. The dog came at his master's call. The latter took Top's head between his hands, and unfastening the collar which the animal wore round his neck, he broke it in two, saying, "There are 2 knives, Pencroft." 2 hurrahs from the sailor was the reply. Top's collar was made of a thin piece of tempered steel. They had only to sharpen it on a piece of sandstone, then to raise the edge on a finer stone. Now sandstone was abundant on the beach, and 2 hours after the stock of tools in the colony consisted of 2 sharp blades, which were easily fixed in solid handles. The production of these their first tools was hailed as a triumph. It was truly a valuable result of their labor, and a very opportune one. They set out. Cyrus Harding proposed that they should return to the western shore of the lake, where the day before he had noticed the clay ground of which he possessed a specimen. They therefore followed the bank of the Mersey, traversed Prospect Heights, and after a walk of 5 miles or more they reached a glade situated 200 feet from Lake Grant. On the way Herbert had discovered a tree, the branches of which the Indians of South America employ for making their bows. It was the crejimba of the palm family, which does not bear edible fruit. Straight branches were cut, the leaves stripped off. It was shaped, stronger in the middle, more slender at the extremities, and nothing remained to be done but to find a plant fit to make the bowstring. This was the Hibiscus heterophyllus, which furnishes fibers of such remarkable tenacity that they have been compared to the tendons of animals. Pencroft thus obtained bows of tolerable strength, for which he only wanted arrows. These were easily made with straight stiff branches, without knots, but the points with which they must be armed, that is to say, a substance to serve in lieu of iron, could not be met with so easily. But Pencroft said that having done his part of the work, chance would do the rest. The settlers arrived on the ground which had been discovered the day before, being composed of the sort of clay which is used for making bricks and tiles. It was very useful for the work in question. There was no great difficulty in it. It was enough to scour the clay with sand, then to mold the bricks and bake them by the heat of a wood fire. Generally bricks are formed in molds, but the engineer contented himself with making them by hand. All that day and the day following were employed in this work. The clay, soaked in water, was mixed by the feet and hands of the manipulators, and then divided into pieces of equal size. A practiced workman can make, without a machine, about 10,000 bricks in 12 hours, but in their 2 days' work the 5 brickmakers on Lincoln Island had not made more than 3,000, which were ranged near each other, until the time when their complete desiccation would permit them to be used in building the oven, that is to say, in 3 or 4 days. It was on the 2nd of April that Harding had employed himself in fixing the orientation of the island, or, in other words, the precise spot where the sun rose. The day before he had noted exactly the hour when the sun disappeared beneath the horizon, making allowance for the refraction. This morning he noted no less exactly the hour at which it reappeared. Between the setting and rising 12 hours, 24 minutes passed. Then, 6 hours, 12 minutes after its rising, the sun on this day would exactly pass the meridian, and the point of the sky which it occupied at this moment would be the north. At the said hour, Cyrus marked this point, and putting in a line with the sun 2 trees, which would serve him for marks, he thus obtained an invariable meridian for his ulterior operations. The settlers employed the 2 days before the oven was built in collecting fuel. Branches were cut all round the glade, and they picked up all the fallen wood under the trees. They were also able to hunt with greater success, since Pencroft now possessed some dozen arrows armed with sharp points. It was Top who had famished these points by bringing in a porcupine, rather inferior eating, but of great value, thanks to the quills with which it bristled. These quills were fixed firmly at the ends of the arrows, the flight of which was made more certain by some cockatoo's feathers. The reporter and Herbert soon became very skillful archers. Game of all sorts in consequence abounded at the chimneys, capybaras, pigeons, agouties, grouse, etc. The greater part of these animals were killed in the part of the forest on the left bank of the Mersey, to which they gave the name of Jacamar Wood, in remembrance of the bird which Pencroft and Herbert had pursued when on their first exploration. This game was eaten fresh, but they preserved some capybara hams by smoking them above a fire of green wood, after having perfumed them with sweet-smelling leaves. However, this food, although very strengthening, was always roast upon roast, and the party would have been delighted to hear some soup bubbling on the hearth. But they must wait till a pot could be made, and consequently till the oven was built. During these excursions, which were not extended far from the brick field, the hunters could discern the recent passage of animals of a large size, armed with powerful claws, but they could not recognize the species. Cyrus Harding advised them to be very careful, as the forest probably enclosed many dangerous beasts. And he did right, truly. Gideon Spilett and Herbert one day saw an animal which resembled a jaguar. Happily the creature did not attack them, or they may not have escaped without a severe wound. As soon as he could get a regular weapon, that is to say, one of the guns which Pencroft begged for, Gideon Spilett resolved to make desperate war against the ferocious beasts and exterminate them from the island. The Chimneys during these few days was not made more comfortable, for the engineer hoped to discover, or build if necessary, a more convenient dwelling. They contented themselves with spreading moss and dry leaves on the sand of the passages, and on these primitive couches the tired workers slept soundly. They also reckoned the days they had passed on Lincoln Island, and from that time kept a regular account. The 5th of April, which was Wednesday, was 12 days from the time when the wind threw the castaways on this shore. On the 6th of April, at daybreak, the engineer and his companions were collected in the glade, at the place where they were going to perform the operation of baking the bricks. Naturally, this had to be in the open air and not in a kiln, or rather, the agglomeration of bricks made an enormous kiln, which would bake itself. The fuel, made of well-prepared faggots, was laid on the ground and surrounded with several rows of dried bricks, which soon formed an enormous cube, to the exterior of which they contrived air holes. The work lasted all day, and it was not till the evening that they set fire to the faggots. No one slept that night, all watching carefully to keep up the fire. The operation lasted 48 hours and succeeded perfectly. It then became necessary to leave the smoking mass to cool, and during this time, Neb and Pencroft, guided by Cyrus Harding, brought on a hurdle made of interlaced branches loads of carbonate of lime and common stones, which were very abundant, to the north of the lake. These stones, when decomposed by heat, made a very strong quicklime, greatly increased by slacking, at least as pure as if it had been produced by the calcination of chalk or marble, mixed with sand. Lime made excellent mortar. The result of these different works was that, on the 9th of April, the engineer had at his disposal a quantity of prepared lime and some thousands of bricks. Without losing an instant, therefore, they began the construction of a kiln to bake the pottery, which was indispensable for their domestic use. They succeeded without much difficulty. 5 days after, the kiln was supplied with coal, which the engineer had discovered lying open to the sky towards the mouth of the Red Creek, and the first smoke escaped from a chimney 20 feet high. The glade was transformed into a manufactory, and Pencroft was not far wrong in believing that from this kiln would issue all the products of modern industry. In the meantime, what the settlers first manufactured was a common pottery in which to cook their food. The chief material was clay, to which Harding added a little lime and quartz. This paste made regular pipe clay, with which they manufactured bowls, cups molded on stones of a proper size, great jars and pots to hold water, etc. The shape of these objects was clumsy and defective, but after they had been baked in a high temperature, the kitchen of the Chimneys was provided with a number of utensils as precious to the settlers as the most beautifully enameled china. We must mention here that Pencroft, desirous to know if the clay thus prepared was worthy of its name of pipe clay, made some large pipes, which he thought charming, but for which, alas, he had no tobacco, and that was a great privation to Pencroft. But tobacco will come, like everything else, he repeated. in a burst of absolute confidence. This work lasted till the 15th of April, and the time was well employed. The settlers, having become potters, made nothing but pottery. When it suited Cyrus Harding to change them into smiths, they would become smiths. But the next day being Sunday, and also Easter Sunday, all agreed to sanctify the day by rest. These Americans were religious men, scrupulous observers of the precepts of the Bible, and their situation could not but develop sentiments of confidence towards the author of all things. On the evening of the 15th of April they returned to the Chimneys, carrying with them the pottery, the furnace being extinguished until they could put it to a new use. Their return was marked by a fortunate incident. The engineer discovered a substance which replaced tinder. It is known that a spongy, velvety flesh is procured from a certain mushroom of the genus Polyborus. Properly prepared, it is extremely inflammable, especially when it has been previously saturated with gunpowder or boiled in a solution of nitrate or chlorate of potash. But till then, they had not found any of these polypores or even any of the morels which could replace them. On this day, the engineer, seeing a plant belonging to the wormwood genus, the principal species of which are absinthe, balm, mint, tarragon, etc., gathered several tufts, and presenting them to the sailor, said, "Here, Pencroft, this will please you." Pencroft looked attentively at the plant, covered with long silky hair, the leaves being clothed with soft down. "What's that, Captain?" asked Pencroft. "Is it tobacco?" "No," replied Harding, "it is wormwood. Chinese wormwood to the learned, but to us it will be tinder. When the wormwood was properly dried it provided them with a very inflammable substance, especially afterwards when the engineer had impregnated it with nitrate of potash, of which the island possessed several beds, and which is in truth saltpeter. The colonists had a good supper that evening. Neb prepared some agouti soup, a smoked capybara ham, to which was added the boiled tubercles of the Caladium macarizum, an herbaceous plant of the arum family. They had an excellent taste, and were very nutritious, being something similar to the substance which is sold in England under the name of Portland sago. They were also a good substitute for bread, which the settlers in Lincoln Island did not yet possess. When supper was finished, before sleeping, Harding and his companions went to take the air on the beach. It was 8 o'clock in the evening. The night was magnificent. The moon, which had been full 5 days before, had not yet risen, but the horizon was already silvered by those soft, pale shades which may be called the dawn of the moon. At the southern zenith glittered the circumpolar constellations, and above all, the Southern Cross, which some days before the engineer had greeted on the summit of Mount Franklin. Cyrus Harding gazed for some time at this splendid constellation, which has at its summit and at its base 2 stars of the first magnitude, at its left arm a star of the second, and at its right arm a star of the third magnitude. Then, after some minutes' thought, "Herbert," he asked of the lad, "is not this the 15th of April?" "Yes, Captain," replied Herbert. "Well, if I am not mistaken, to-morrow will be one of the 4 days in the year in which the real time is identical with average time. That is to say, my boy, that to-morrow, to within some seconds, the sun will pass the meridian just at midday by the clocks. If the weather is fine, I think that I shall obtain the longitude of the island with an approximation of some degrees." "Without instruments, without sextant?" asked Gideon Spilett. "Yes," replied the engineer. "Also, since the night is clear, I will try, this very evening, to obtain our latitude by calculating the height of the Southern Cross, that is, from the southern pole above the horizon. You understand, my friends, that before undertaking the work of installation in earnest it is not enough to have found out that this land is an island. We must, as nearly as possible, know at what distance it is situated, either from the American continent or Australia, or from the principal archipelagos of the Pacific. In fact, said the reporter, instead of building a house, it would be more important to build a boat if by chance we are not more than 100 miles from an inhabited coast. That is why, returned Harding, I am going to try this evening to calculate the latitude of Lincoln Island, and tomorrow, at midday, I will try to calculate the longitude. If the engineer had possessed a sextant, an apparatus with which the angular distance of objects can be measured with great precision, there would have been no difficulty in the operation. This evening by the height of the pole, the next day by the passing of the sun at the meridian, he would obtain the position of the island. But as they had not one, he would have to supply the deficiency. Harding then entered the chimneys. By the light of the fire he cut two little flat rulers, which he joined together at one end so as to form a pair of compasses whose legs could separate or come together. The fastening was fixed with a strong acacia thorn, which was found in the wood pile. This instrument finished, the engineer returned to the beach, but as it was necessary to take the height of the pole from above a clear horizon, that is, a sea horizon, and as Claw Cape hid the southern horizon, he was obliged to look for a more suitable station. The best would evidently have been the shore exposed directly to the south, but the Mersey would have to be crossed, and that was a difficulty. Harding resolved, in consequence, to make his observation from Prospect Heights, taking into consideration its height above the level of the sea, a height which he intended to calculate next day by a simple process of elementary geometry. The settlers, therefore, went to the plateau, ascending the left bank of the Mersey, and placed themselves on the edge which looked northwest and southeast, that is, above the curiously shaped rocks which bordered the river. This part of the plateau commanded the heights of the left bank, which sloped away to the extremity of Claw Cape and to the southern side of the island. No obstacle intercepted their gaze, which swept the horizon in a semicircle from the cape to Reptile End. To the south, the horizon, lighted by the first rays of the moon, was very clearly defined against the sky. At this moment the Southern Cross presented itself to the observer in an inverted position, the star Alpha marking its base, which is near to the southern pole. This constellation is not situated as near to the Antarctic pole as the polar star is to the Arctic pole. The star Alpha is about 27 degrees from it. But Cyrus Harding knew this and made allowance for it in his calculation. He took care also to observe the moment when it passed the meridian below the pole, which would simplify the operation. Cyrus Harding pointed one leg of the compasses to the horizon, the other to Alpha, and the space between the two legs gave him the angular distance which separated Alpha from the horizon. In order to fix the angle obtained, he fastened with thorns the two pieces of wood on a third placed transversely, so that their separation should be properly maintained. That done, there was only the angle to calculate by bringing back the observation to the level of the sea, taking into consideration the depression of the horizon, which would necessitate measuring the height of the cliff. The value of this angle would give the height of Alpha, and consequently that of the pole above the horizon, that is to say, the latitude of the island, since the latitude of a point of the globe is always equal to the height of the pole above the horizon of this point. Chapter 14. The next day, the 16th of April, and Easter Sunday, the settlers issued from the chimneys at daybreak and proceeded to wash their linen. The engineer intended to manufacture soap as soon as he could procure the necessary materials, soda or potash, fat or oil. The important question of renewing their wardrobe would be treated of in the proper time and place. At any rate, their clothes would last at least 6 months longer, for they were strong and could resist the wear of manual labor. But all would depend on the situation of the island with regard to inhabited land. This would be settled today if the weather permitted. The sun rising above a clear horizon announced a magnificent day, one of those beautiful autumn days which are like the last farewells of the warm season. It was now necessary to complete the observations of the evening before by measuring the height of the cliff above the level of the sea. Shall you not need an instrument similar to the one which you used yesterday? Said Herbert to the engineer. No, my boy, replied the latter. We are going to proceed differently, but in as precise a way. Herbert, wishing to learn everything he could, followed the engineer to the beach. Pencroft, Neb, and the reporter remained behind and occupied themselves in different ways. Cyrus Harding had provided himself with a straight stick, 12 feet long, which he had measured as exactly as possible by comparing it with his own height, which he knew to a hair. Herbert carried a plumb line, which Harding had given him, that is to say, a simple stone fastened to the end of a flexible fiber. Having reached a spot about 20 feet from the edge of the beach and nearly 500 feet from the cliff, which rose perpendicularly, Harding thrust the pole 2 feet into the sand, and wedging it up carefully, he managed, by means of the plumb line, to erect it perpendicularly with the plane of the horizon. That done, he retired the necessary distance, when, lying on the sand, his eye glanced at the same time at the top of the pole and the crest of the cliff. He carefully marked the place with a little stick. Then, addressing Herbert, "Do you know the first principles of geometry?" he asked. "Slightly, Captain," replied Herbert, who did not wish to put himself forward. "You remember what are the properties of two similar triangles?" "Yes," replied Herbert, "their homologous sides are proportional." "Well, my boy, I have just constructed two similar right-angled triangles. The first, the smallest, has for its sides the perpendicular pole, the distance which separates the little stick from the foot of the pole, and my visual ray for hypotenuse. The second has for its sides the perpendicular cliff, the height of which we wish to measure, the distance which separates the little stick from the bottom of the cliff, and my visual ray also forms its hypotenuse, which proves to be prolongation of that of the first triangle." "Ah, Captain, I understand," cried Herbert. "As the distance from the stick to the pole is to the distance from the stick to the base of the cliff, so is the height of the pole to the height of the cliff." "Just so, Herbert," replied the engineer, "and when we have measured the two first distances, knowing the height of the pole, we shall only have a sum in proportion to do, which will give us the height of the cliff, and will save us the trouble of measuring it directly." The two horizontal distances were found out by means of the pole, whose length above the sand was exactly 10 feet. The first distance was 15 feet between the stick and the place where the pole was thrust into the sand. The second distance between the stick and the bottom of the cliff was 500 feet. These measurements finished, Cyrus Harding and the lad returned to the Chimneys. The engineer then took a flat stone which he had brought back from one of his previous excursions, a sort of slate, on which it was easy to trace figures with a sharp shell. He then proved the following proportions: 15:500:10:x, 500x10 equals 5000, 5000/15 equals 333.3, from which it was proved that the granite cliff measured 333 feet in height. Cyrus Harding then took the instrument, which he had made the evening before, the space between its two legs giving the angular distance between the star Alpha and the horizon. He measured, very exactly, the opening of this angle on a circumference which he divided into 360 equal parts. Now, this angle, by adding to it the 27 degrees which separated Alpha from the Antarctic pole, and by reducing to the level of the sea the height of the cliff on which the observation had been made, was found to be 53 degrees. These 53 degrees being subtracted from 90 degrees, the distance from the pole to the equator, there remained 37 degrees. Cyrus Harding concluded, therefore, that Lincoln Island was situated on the 37th degree of the southern latitude, or taking into consideration through the imperfection of the performance, an error of 5 degrees, that it must be situated between the 35th and the 40th parallel. There was only the longitude to be obtained, and the position of the island would be determined. The engineer hoped to attempt this the same day at 12 o'clock, at which moment the sun would pass the meridian. It was decided that Sunday should be spent in a walk, or rather an exploring expedition, to that side of the island between the north of the lake and Shark Gulf, and if there was time they would push their discoveries to the northern side of Cape South Mandible. They would breakfast on the Downs and not return till evening. At 8:30 the little band was following the edge of the channel. On the other side, on Safety Islet, numerous birds were gravely strutting. They were divers, easily recognized by their cry, which much resembles the braying of a donkey. Pencroft only considered them in an eatable point of view, and learnt with some satisfaction that their flesh, though blackish, is not bad food. Great amphibious creatures could also be seen crawling on the sand. Seals, doubtless, who appeared to have chosen the islet for a place of refuge. It was impossible to think of those animals in an alimentary point of view, for their oily flesh is detestable. However, Cyrus Harding observed them attentively, and without making known his idea, he announced to his companions that very soon they would pay a visit to the islet. The beach was strewn with innumerable shells, some of which would have rejoiced the heart of a conchologist. There were, among others, the Phasianella, the Terebratule, etc. But what would be of more use was the discovery, by Neb, at low tide, of a large oyster bed among the rocks, nearly 5 miles from the Chimneys. Neb will not have lost his day, cried Pencroft, looking at the spacious oyster bed. It is really a fortunate discovery, said the reporter, and as it is said that each oyster produces yearly from 50 to 60,000 eggs, we shall have an inexhaustible supply there. Only I believe that the oyster is not very nourishing, said Herbert. No, replied Harding. The oyster contains very little nitrogen, and if a man lived exclusively on them, he would have to eat not less than 15 to 16 dozen a day. Capital, replied Pencroft. We may swallow dozens and dozens without exhausting the bed. Shall we take some for breakfast? And without waiting for a reply to this proposal, knowing that it would be approved of, the sailor and Neb detached a quantity of the mollusks. They put them in a sort of net of hibiscus fiber, which Neb had manufactured, and which already contained food. They then continued to climb the coast between the Downs and the sea. From time to time Harding consulted his watch, so as to be prepared in time for the solar observation, which had to be made exactly at midday. All that part of the island was very barren as far as the point which closed Union Bay, and which had received the name of Cape South Mandible. Nothing could be seen there but sand and shells mingled with debris of lava. A few seabirds frequented this desolate coast, gulls, great albatrosses, as well as wild duck, for which Pencroft had a great fancy. He tried to knock some over with an arrow, but without result, for they seldom perched, and he could not hit them on the wing. This led the sailor to repeat to the engineer, "You see, Captain, so long as we have not 1 or 2 fowling pieces, we shall never get anything." "Doubtless, Pencroft," replied the reporter, "but it depends on you. Procure us some iron for the barrels, steel for the hammers, saltpeter, coal and sulfur for powder, mercury and nitric acid for the fulminate, and lead for the shot, and the captain will make us first-rate guns." "Oh," replied the engineer, "we may, no doubt, find all these substances on the island, but a gun is a delicate instrument and needs very particular tools. However, we shall see later." "Why," cried Pencroft, "were we obliged to throw overboard all the weapons we had with us in the car, all our implements, evening our pocket knives? But if we had not thrown them away, Pencroft, the balloon would have thrown us to the bottom of the sea," said Herbert. "What you say is true, my boy," replied the sailor. Then passing to another idea, Think, said he, how astounded Jonathan Forster and his companions must have been when, next morning, they found the place empty and the machine flown away. I am utterly indifferent about knowing what they may have thought, said the reporter. It was all my idea. That, said Pencroft, with a satisfied air. A splendid idea, Pencroft, replied Gideon Spilett, laughing, and which has placed us where we are. I would rather be here than in the hands of the Southerners, cried the sailor, especially since the captain has been kind enough to come and join us again. So would I, truly, replied the reporter. Besides, what do we want? Nothing, if that is not everything, replied Pencroft, laughing and shrugging his shoulders. But, some day or other, we shall find means of going away. Sooner, perhaps, than you imagine, my friends, remarked the engineer. If Lincoln Island is but a medium distance from an inhabited island or from a continent, we shall know in an hour. I have not a map of the Pacific, but my memory has preserved a very clear recollection of its southern part. The latitude which I obtained yesterday placed New Zealand to the west of Lincoln Island and the coast of Chile to the east, but between these two countries there is a distance of at least 6,000 miles. It has, therefore, to be determined what point in this great space the island occupies, and this the longitude will give us soon, with a sufficient approximation, I hope. Is not the archipelago of the Paumatus the nearest point to us in latitude? Asked Herbert. Yes, replied the engineer, but the distance which separates us from it is more than 1,200 miles. And that way? Asked Neb, who followed the conversation with extreme interest, pointing to the south. That way, nothing, replied Pencroft. Nothing, truly, added the engineer. Well, Cyrus, asked the reporter, if Lincoln Island is not more than 2,000 or 3,000 miles from New Zealand or Chile. Well, replied the engineer, instead of building a house we will build a boat, and Master Pencroft shall be put in command. Well then, cried the sailor, I am quite ready to be captain as soon as you can make a craft that's able to keep at sea. We shall do it, if it is necessary, replied Cyrus Harding. But while these men, who really hesitated at nothing, were talking, the hour approached at which the observation was to be made. What Cyrus Harding was to do to ascertain the passage of the sun at the meridian of the island without an instrument of any sort, Herbert could not guess. The observers were then about 6 miles from the Chimneys, not far from that part of the downs in which the engineer had been found after his enigmatical preservation. They halted at this place and prepared for breakfast, for it was 11:30. Herbert went for some fresh water from a stream which ran near and brought it back in a jug, which Neb had provided. During these preparations Harding arranged everything for his astronomical observation. He chose a clear place on the shore, which the ebbing tide had left perfectly level. This bed of fine sand was as smooth as ice, not a grain out of place. It was of little importance whether it was horizontal or not, and it did not matter much whether the stick 6 feet high, which was planted there, rose perpendicularly. On the contrary, the engineer inclined it towards the south, that is to say, in the direction of the coast opposite to the sun, for it must not be forgotten that the settlers in Lincoln Island, as the island was situated in the southern hemisphere, saw the radiant planet describe its diurnal arc above the northern and not above the southern horizon. Herbert now understood how the engineer was going to proceed to ascertain the culmination of the sun, that is to say its passing the meridian of the island, or, in other words, determine due south. It was by means of the shadow cast on the sand by the stick, a way which, for want of an instrument, would give him a suitable approach to the result which he wished to obtain. In fact, the moment when this shadow would reach its minimum of length would be exactly 12 o'clock, and it would be enough to watch the extremity of the shadow so as to ascertain the instant when, after having successively diminished, it began to lengthen. By inclining his stick to the side opposite to the sun, Cyrus Harding made the shadow longer, and consequently its modifications would be more easily ascertained. In fact, the longer the needle of a dial is, the more easily can the movement of its point be followed. The shadow of the stick was nothing but the needle of a dial. The moment had come, and Cyrus Harding knelt on the sand, and with little wooden pegs, which he stuck into the sand, he began to mark the successive diminutions of the stick's shadow. His companions, bending over him, watched the operation with extreme interest. The reporter held his chronometer in his hand, ready to tell the hour, which it marked when the shadow would be at its shortest. Moreover, as Cyrus Harding was working on the 16th of April, the day on which the true and the average time are identical, the hour given by Gideon Spilett would be the true hour then at Washington, which would simplify the calculation. Meanwhile, as the sun slowly advanced, the shadow slowly diminished, and when it appeared to Cyrus Harding that it was beginning to increase, he asked, "What o'clock is it?" 1 minute past 5, replied Gideon Spilett directly. They had now only to calculate the operation. Nothing could be easier. It could be seen that there existed, in round numbers, a difference of 5 hours between the meridian of Washington and that of Lincoln Island. That is to say, it was midday in Lincoln Island when it was already 5 o'clock in the evening in Washington. Now the sun, in its apparent movement round the earth, traverses 1 degree in 4 minutes, or 15 degrees an hour. 15 degrees multiplied by 5 hours give 75 degrees. Then, since Washington is 77°311, as much as to say 77 degrees counted from the meridian of Greenwich, which the Americans take for their starting point for longitudes concurrently with the English, it followed that the island must be situated 77 and 75 degrees west of the meridian of Greenwich, that is to say, on the 152nd degree of west longitude. Cyrus Harding announced this result to his companions, and taking into consideration errors of observation, as he had done for the latitude, he believed he could positively affirm that the position of Lincoln Island was between the 35th and the 37th parallel, and between the 150th and the 155th meridian to the west of the meridian of Greenwich. The possible fault which he attributed to errors in the observation was, it may be seen, of 5 degrees on both sides, which, at 60 miles to a degree, would give an error of 300 miles in latitude and longitude for the exact position. But this error would not influence the determination which it was necessary to take. It was very evident that Lincoln Island was at such a distance from every country or island that it would be too hazardous to attempt to reach one in a frail boat. In fact, this calculation placed it at least 1,200 miles from Tahiti and the islands of the archipelago of the Bermudas, more than 1,800 miles from New Zealand, and more than 4,500 miles from the American coast. Chapter 15. The next day, the 17th of April, the sailor's first words were addressed to Gideon Spilett. "Well, sir," he asked, "what shall we do today?" "What the captain pleases," replied the reporter. Till then the engineer's companions had been brickmakers and potters, now they were to become metallurgists. The day before, after breakfast, they had explored as far as the point of Mandible Cape, 7 miles distant from the Chimneys. There, the long series of downs ended, and the soil had a volcanic appearance. There were no longer high cliffs as at Prospect Heights, but a strange and capricious border which surrounded the narrow gulf between the two capes, formed of mineral matter thrown up by the volcano. Arrived at this point, the settlers retraced their steps, and at nightfall entered the Chimneys, but they did not sleep before the question of knowing whether they could think of leaving Lincoln Island or not was definitely settled. The 1,200 miles which separated the island from the Bermudas Island was a considerable distance, a boat could not cross it, especially at the approach of the bad season. Pencroft had expressly declared this. Now, to construct a simple boat, even with the necessary tools, was a difficult work, and the colonists not having tools, they must begin by making hammers, axes, adzes, saws, augers, planes, etc., which would take some time. It was decided, therefore, that they would winter at Lincoln Island, and that they would look for a more comfortable dwelling than the Chimneys in which to pass the winter. Months before anything else could be done, it was necessary to make the iron ore, of which the engineer had observed some traces in the northwest part of the island, fit for use by converting it either into iron or into steel. Metals are not generally found in the ground in a pure state. For the most part they are combined with oxygen or sulfur. Such was the case with the two specimens which Cyrus Harding had brought back, one of magnetic iron, not carbonated, the other a pyrite, also called sulphuret, of iron. It was, therefore, the first, the oxide of iron, which they must reduce with coal, that is to say, get rid of the oxygen, to obtain it in a pure state. This reduction is made by subjecting the ore with coal to a high temperature, either by the rapid and easy Catalan method, which has the advantage of transforming the ore into iron in a single operation, or by the blast furnace, which first smelts the ore, then changes it into iron by carrying away the 3 to 4% of coal which is combined with it. Now Cyrus Harding wanted iron, and he wished to obtain it as soon as possible. The ore which he had picked up was in itself very pure and rich. It was the oxidulous iron, which is found in confused masses of a deep gray color. It gives a black dust, crystallized in the form of the regular octahedron. Native lodestones consist of this ore, and iron of the first quality is made in Europe from that with which Sweden and Norway are so abundantly supplied. Not far from this vein was the vein of coal already made use of by the settlers. The ingredients for the manufacture being close together would greatly facilitate the treatment of the ore. This is the cause of the wealth of the mines in Great Britain, where the coal aids the manufacture of the metal extracted from the same soil at the same time as itself. Then, Captain, said Pencroft, we are going to work iron ore. Yes, my friend, replied the engineer, and for that, something which will please you, we must begin by having a seal hunt on the islet. A seal hunt, cried the sailor, turning towards Gideon Spilett. Ah, seals needed to make iron? Since Cyrus has said so, replied the reporter. But the engineer had already left the Chimneys, and Pencroft prepared for the seal hunt without having received any other explanation. Cyrus Harding, Herbert, Gideon Spilett, Neb, and the sailor were soon collected on the shore, at a place where the channel left a ford passable at low tide. The hunters could therefore traverse it without getting wet higher than the knee. Harding then put his foot on the islet for the first, and his companions for the second time. On their landing, some hundreds of penguins looked fearlessly at them. The hunters, armed with sticks, could have killed them easily, but they were not guilty of such useless massacre, as it was important not to frighten the seals, who were lying on the sand several cable lengths off. They also respected certain innocent-looking birds, whose wings were reduced to the state of stumps, spread out like fins, ornamented with feathers of a scaly appearance. The settlers, therefore, prudently advanced towards the north point, walking over ground riddled with little holes, which formed nests for the sea birds. Towards the extremity of the islet appeared great black heads floating just above the water, having exactly the appearance of rocks in motion. These were the seals which were to be captured. It was necessary, however, first to allow them to land, for with their close, short hair and their fusiform conformation, being excellent swimmers, it is difficult to catch them in the sea, while on land their short, webbed feet prevent their having more than a slow, waddling movement. Pencroft knew the habits of these creatures, and he advised waiting till They were stretched on the sand when the sun, before long, would send them to sleep. They must then manage to cut off their retreat and knock them on the head. The hunters, having concealed themselves behind the rocks, waited silently. An hour passed before the seals came to play on the sand. They could count half a dozen. Pencroft and Herbert then went round the point of the islet, so as to take them in the rear and cut off their retreat. During this time Cyrus Harding, Spilett, and Nab, crawling behind the rocks, glided towards the future scene of combat. All at once the tall figure of the sailor appeared. Pencroft shouted. The engineer and his two companions threw themselves between the sea and the seals. Two of the animals soon lay dead on the sand, but the rest regained the sea in safety. Here are the seals required, Captain, said the sailor, advancing towards the engineer. Capital, replied Harding. We will make bellows of them. Bellows, cried Pencroft. Well, these are lucky seals. It was, in fact, a blowing machine, necessary for the treatment of the ore that the engineer wished to manufacture with the skins of the amphibious creatures. They were of a medium size, for their length did not exceed 6 feet. They resembled a dog about the head. As it was useless to burden themselves with the weight of both the animals, Neb and Pencroft resolved to skin them on the spot, while Cyrus Harding and the reporter continued to explore the islet. The sailor and the negro cleverly performed the operation, and 3 hours afterwards Cyrus Harding had at his disposal 2 seals' skins, which he intended to use in this state, without subjecting them to any tanning process. The settlers waited till the tide was again low, and crossing the channel they entered the Chimneys. The skins had then to be stretched on a frame of wood and sewn by means of fibers so as to preserve the air without allowing too much to escape. Cyrus Harding had nothing but the 2 steel blades from Top's collar, and yet he was so clever, and his companions aided him with so much intelligence, that 3 days afterwards the little colony's stock of tools was augmented by a blowing machine, destined to inject the air into the amid of the ore when it should be subjected to heat, an indispensable condition to the success of the operation. On the morning of the 20th of April began the metallic period, as the reporter called it in his notes. The engineer had decided, as has been said, to operate near the veins both of coal and ore. Now, according to his observations, these veins were situated at the foot of the northeast spurs of Mount Franklin, that is to say, a distance of 6 miles from their home. It was impossible, therefore, to return every day to the Chimneys, and it was agreed that the little colony should camp under a hut of branches, so that the important operation could be followed night and day. This settled, they set out in the morning. Neb and Pencroft dragged the bellows on a hurdle, also a quantity of vegetables and animals, which they besides could renew on the way. The road led through Jacamar Wood, which they traversed obliquely from southeast to northwest, and in the thickest part it was necessary to beat a path which would in the future form the most direct road to Prospect Heights and Mount Franklin. The trees belonging to the species already discovered were magnificent. Herbert found some new ones, among others some which Pencroft called shamleeks, for, in spite of their size, they were of the same liliaceous family as the onion, chive, shallot, or asparagus. These trees produce ligneous roots which, when cooked, are excellent. From them, by fermentation, a very agreeable liquor is made. They therefore made a good store of the roots. The journey through the wood was long. It lasted the whole day, and so allowed plenty of time for examining the flora and fauna. Top, who took special charge of the fauna, ran through the grass and brushwood, putting up all sorts of game. Herbert and Gideon Spilett killed 2 kangaroos with bows and arrows, and also an animal which strongly resembled both a hedgehog and an anteater. It was like the first, because it rolled itself into a ball and bristled with spines, and the second because it had sharp claws, a long slender snout which terminated in a bird's beak, and an extendable tongue covered with little thorns, which served to hold the insects. And when it is in the pot, asked Pencroft naturally, what will it be? Like an excellent piece of beef, replied Herbert. We will not ask more from it, replied the sailor. During this excursion they saw several wild boars, which, however, did not offer to attack the little band, and it appeared as if they would not meet with any dangerous beasts, when, in a thick part of the wood, the reporter thought he saw, some paces from him among the lower branches of a tree, an animal which he took for a bear, and which he very tranquilly began to draw. Happily for Gideon Spilett, the animal in question did not belong to the redoubtable family of the plantigrades. It was only a koala, better known under the name of the sloth, being about the size of a large dog, and having stiff hair of a dirty color, the paws armed with strong claws, which enabled it to climb trees and feed on the leaves. Having identified the animal, which they did not disturb, Gideon Spilett erased bear from the title of his sketch, putting koala in its place, and the journey was resumed. At 5 o'clock in the evening, Cyrus Harding gave the signal to halt. They were now outside the forest, at the beginning of the powerful spurs, which supported Mount Franklin towards the west. At a distance of some 100 feet flowed the Red Creek, and consequently plenty of fresh water was within their reach. The camp was soon organized. In less than an hour, on the edge of the forest among the trees, a hut of branches interlaced with creepers and pasted over with clay offered a tolerable shelter. Their geological researches were put off till the next day. Supper was prepared, a good fire blazed before the hut, the roast turned, and at 8 o'clock, while one of the settlers watched to keep up the fire, in case any wild beasts should prowl in the neighborhood, the others slept soundly. The next day, the 21st of April, Cyrus Harding, accompanied by Herbert, went to look for the soil of ancient formation, on which he had already discovered a specimen of ore. They found the vein above ground, near the source of the creek, at the foot of one of the northeastern spurs. This ore, very rich in iron, enclosed in its fusible veinstone, was perfectly suited to the mode of reduction which the engineer intended to employ. That is the Catalan method, but simplified, as it is used in Corsica. In fact, the Catalan method, properly so called, requires the construction of kilns and crucibles, in which the ore and the coal, placed in alternate layers, are transformed and reduced. But Cyrus Harding intended to economize these constructions, and wished simply to form, with the ore and the coal, a cubic mass, to the center of which he would direct the wind from his bellows. Doubtless it was the proceeding employed by Tubal-Cain and the first metallurgists of the inhabited world. Now that which had succeeded with the grandson of Adam, and which still yielded good results in countries rich in ore and fuel, could not but succeed with the settlers in Lincoln Island. The coal, as well as the ore, was collected without trouble on the surface of the ground. They first broke the ore into little pieces, and cleansed them with the hand from the impurities which soiled their surface. Then coal and ore were arranged in heaps and in successive layers, as the charcoal burner does with the wood which he wishes to carbonize. In this way, under the influence of the air projected by the blowing machine, the coal would be transformed into carbonic acid, then into oxide of carbon, its use being to reduce the oxide of iron, that is to say, to rid it of the oxygen. Thus the engineer proceeded. The bellows of sealskin, furnished at its extremity with a nozzle of clay, which had been previously fabricated in the pottery kiln, was established near the heap of ore. Using the mechanism, which consisted of a frame, cords of fiber, and counterpoise, he threw into the mass an abundance of air, which by raising the temperature also concurred with the chemical transformation to produce in time pure iron. The operation was difficult. All the patience, all the ingenuity of the settlers was needed, but at last it succeeded, and the result was a lump of iron reduced to a spongy state, which it was necessary to shingle and faggot, that is to say, to forge so as to expel from it the liquefied vein stone. These amateur smiths had, of course, no hammer, but they were in no worse a situation than the first metallurgist, and therefore did what, no doubt, he had to do. A handle was fixed to the first lump, and was used as a hammer to forge the second on a granite anvil, and thus they obtained a coarse but useful metal. At length, after many trials and much fatigue, on the 25th of April several bars of iron were forged and transformed into tools, crowbars, pincers, pickaxes, spades, etc., which Pencroft and Neb declared to be real jewels. But the metal was not yet in its most serviceable state, that is, of steel. Now steel is a combination of iron and coal, which is extracted either from the liquid ore by taking from it the excess of coal, or from the iron by adding to it the coal which was wanting. The first, obtained by the decarburation of the metal, gives natural or puddled steel. The second, produced by the carburation of the iron, gives steel of cementation. It was the last which Cyrus Harding intended to forge, as he possessed iron in a pure state. He succeeded by heating the metal with powdered coal in a crucible, which had previously been manufactured from clay, suitable for the purpose. He then worked this steel, which is malleable both when hot or cold, with the hammer. Neb and Pencroft, cleverly directed, made hatchets, which, heated red hot, and plunged suddenly into cold water, acquired an excellent temper. Other instruments, of course roughly fashioned, were also manufactured. Blades for planes, axes, hatchets, pieces of steel to be transformed into saws, chisels, then iron for spades, pickaxes, hammers, nails, etc. Chapter 16. It was the 6th of May, a day which corresponds to the 6th of November in the countries of the northern hemisphere. The sky had been obscured for some days, and it was of importance to make preparations for the winter. However, the temperature was not as yet much lower, and a centigrade thermometer, transported to Lincoln Island, would still have marked an average of 10 to 12 degrees above zero. This was not surprising, since Lincoln Island, probably situated between the 35th and 40th parallel, would be subject, in the southern hemisphere, to the same climate as Sicily or Greece in the northern hemisphere. But as Greece and Sicily have severe cold, producing snow and ice, so doubtless would Lincoln Island in the severest part of the winter, and it was advisable to provide against it. In any case, if cold did not yet threaten them, the rainy season would begin, and on this lonely island, exposed to all the fury of the elements in a mid-ocean, bad weather would be frequent and probably terrible. The question of a more comfortable dwelling than the Chimneys must therefore be seriously considered and promptly resolved on. Pencroft, naturally, had some predilection for the retreat which he had discovered, but he well understood that another must be found. The Chimneys had been already visited by the sea, under circumstances which are known, and it would not do to be exposed again to a similar accident. Besides, added Cyrus Harding, who this day was talking of these things with his companions, we have some precautions to take. Why, the island is not inhabited, said the reporter. That is probable, replied the engineer, although we have not yet explored the interior. But if no human beings are found, I fear that dangerous animals may abound. It is necessary to guard against a possible attack, so that we shall not be obliged to watch every night, or to keep up a fire. And then, my friends, we must foresee everything. We are here in a part of the Pacific often frequented by Malay pirates. What? Said Herbert, at such a distance from land. Yes, my boy, replied the engineer. These pirates are bold sailors as well as formidable enemies, and we must take measures accordingly. Well, replied Pencroft, we will fortify ourselves against savages with 2 legs as well as against savages with 4. But, Captain, will it not be best to explore every part of the island before undertaking anything else? That would be best, added Gideon Spilett. Who knows if we may not find on the opposite side one of the caverns, which we have searched for in vain here? That is true, replied the engineer, but you forget, my friends, that it will be necessary to establish ourselves in the neighborhood of a watercourse, and that, from the summit of Mount Franklin, we could not see towards the west either stream or river. Here, on the contrary, we are placed between the Mercy and Lake Grant, an advantage which must not be neglected. And, besides, this side, looking towards the east, is not exposed as the other is to the trade winds, which in this hemisphere blow from the northwest. Then, Captain, replied the sailor, let us build a house on the edge of the lake. Neither bricks nor tools are wanting now. After having been brickmakers, potters, smelters, and smiths, we shall surely know how to be masons. Yes, my friend, but before coming to any decision we must consider the matter thoroughly. A natural dwelling would spare us much work, and would be a sure retreat, for it would be as well defended against enemies from the interior as those from outside. That is true, Cyrus, replied the reporter, but we have already examined all that mass of granite, and there is not a hole, not a cranny, no, not one, added Pencroft. Ah, if we were able to dig out a dwelling in that cliff at a good height, so as to be out of the reach of harm, that would be capital. I can see that on the front, which looks seaward, 5 or 6 rooms, with windows to light them, said Herbert, laughing, and a staircase to climb up to them, added Neb. You are laughing, cried the sailor, and why? What is there impossible in what I propose? Haven't we got pickaxes and spades? Won't Captain Harding be able to make powder to blow up the mine? Isn't it true, Captain, that you will make powder the very day we want it? Cyrus Harding listened to the enthusiastic Pencroft developing his fanciful projects. To attack this mass of granite, evening by a mine, was Herculean work, and it was really vexing that nature could not help them at their need. But the engineer did not reply to the sailor except by proposing to examine the cliff more attentively from the mouth of the river to the angle which terminated it on the north. They went out, therefore, and the exploration was made with extreme care over an extent of nearly 2 miles. But in no place in the bare, straight cliff could any cavity be found. The nests of the rock pigeons, which fluttered at its summit, were only, in reality, holes bored at the very top and on the irregular edge of the granite. It was a provoking circumstance, and as to attacking this cliff, either with pickaxe or with powder, so as to effect a sufficient excavation, it was not to be thought of. It so happened that, on all this part of the shore, Pencroft had discovered the only habitable shelter, that is to say, the chimneys, which now had to be abandoned. The exploration ended, the colonists found themselves at the north angle of the cliff, where it terminated in long slopes which died away on the shore. From this place to its extreme limit in the west, it only formed a sort of declivity, a thick mass of stones, earth, and sand, bound together by plants, bushes, and grass inclined at an angle of only 45 degrees. Clumps of trees grew on these slopes, which were also carpeted with thick grass. But the vegetation did not extend far, and a long, sandy plain, which began at the foot of these slopes, reached to the beach. Cyrus Harding thought, not without reason, that the overplus of the lake must overflow on this side. The excess of water furnished by the Red Creek must also escape by some channel or other. Now the engineer had not yet found this channel on any part of the shore already explored, that is to say, from the mouth of the stream on the west of Prospect Heights. The engineer now proposed to his companions to climb the slope and to return to the Chimneys by the heights, while exploring the northern and eastern shores of the lake. The proposal was accepted, and in a few minutes Herbert and Neb were on the upper plateau. Cyrus Harding, Gideon, Spilett, and Pencroft followed with more sedate steps. The beautiful sheet of water glittered through the trees under the rays of the sun. In this direction the country was charming. The eye feasted on the groups of trees. Some old trunks, bent with age, showed black against the verdant grass which covered the ground. Crowds of brilliant cockatoos screamed among the branches, moving prisms, hopping from one bough to another. The settlers, instead of going directly to the north bank of the lake, made a circuit round the edge of the plateau, so as to join the mouth of the creek on its left bank. It was a detour of more than a mile and a half. Walking was easy, for the trees, widely spread, left a considerable space between them. The fertile zone evidently stopped at this point, and vegetation would be less vigorous in the part between the course of the creek and the Mersey. Cyrus Harding and his companions walked over this new ground with great care. Bows, arrows, and sticks with sharp iron points were their only weapons. However, no wild beast showed itself, and it was probable that these animals frequented rather the thick forests in the south. But the settlers had the disagreeable surprise of seeing Top stop before a snake of great size, measuring from 14 to 15 feet in length. Neb killed it by a blow from his stick. Cyrus Harding examined the reptile and declared it not venomous, for it belonged to that species of diamond serpents which the natives of New South Wales rear. But it was possible that others existed whose bite was mortal, such as the deaf vipers with forked tails, which rise up under the feet, or those winged snakes furnished with 2 ears, which enable them to proceed with great rapidity. Top, the first moment of surprise over, began a reptile chase with such eagerness that they feared for his safety. His master called him back directly. The mouth of the Red Creek, at the place where it entered into the lake, was soon reached. The explorers recognized on the opposite shore the point which they had visited on their descent from Mount Franklin. Cyrus Harding ascertained that the flow of water into it from the creek was considerable. Nature must therefore have provided some place for the escape of the overplus. This doubtless formed a fall which, if it could be discovered, would be of great use. The colonists, walking apart, but not straying far from each other, began to skirt the edge of the lake, which was very steep. The water appeared to be full of fish, and Pencroft resolved to make some fishing rods, so as to try and catch some. The northeast point was first to be doubled. It may have been supposed that the discharge of water was at this place, for the extremity of the lake was almost on a level with the edge of the plateau. But no signs of this were discovered, and the colonists continued to explore the bank, which, after a slight bend, descended parallel to the shore. On this side the banks were less woody, but clumps of trees here and there added to the picturesqueness of the country. Lake Grant was viewed from there in all its extent, and no breath disturbed the surface of its waters. Top, in beating the bushes, put up flocks of birds of different kinds, which Gideon Spilett and Herbert saluted with arrows. One was hit by the lad and fell into some marshy grass. Top rushed forward and brought a beautiful swimming bird of a slate color, short beak, very developed frontal plate, and wings edged with white. It was a coot the size of a large partridge, belonging to the group of macrodactyls which form the transition between the order of wading birds and that of palmites. Sorry game, in truth, and its flavor is far from pleasant. But Top was not so particular in these things as his masters, and it was agreed that the coot should be for his supper. The settlers were now following the eastern bank of the lake, and they would not be long in reaching the part which they already knew. The engineer was much surprised at not seeing any indication of the discharge of water. The reporter and the sailor talked with him, and he could not conceal his astonishment. At this moment Top, who had been very quiet till then, gave signs of agitation. The intelligent animal went backwards and forwards on the shore, stopped suddenly, and looked at the water, one paw raised, as if he was pointing at some invisible game. Then he barked furiously, and was suddenly silent. Neither Cyrus Harding nor his companions had at first paid any attention to Top's behavior, but the dog's barking soon became so frequent that the engineer noticed it. "What is there, Top?" he asked. The dog bounded towards his master, seeming to be very uneasy, and then rushed again towards the bank. Then, all at once, he plunged into the lake. "Here, Top!" cried Cyrus Harding, who did not like his dog to venture into the treacherous water. "What's happening down there?" asked Pencroft, examining the surface of the lake. "Top smells some amphibious creature," replied Herbert. "An alligator, perhaps," said the reporter. "I do not think so," replied Harding. "Alligators are only met with in regions less elevated in latitude." Meanwhile Top had returned at his master's call, and had regained the shore, but he could not stay quiet. He plunged in among the tall grass, and guided by instinct, he appeared to follow some invisible being which was slipping along under the surface of the water. However, the water was calm. Not a ripple disturbed its surface. Several times the settlers stopped on the bank and observed it attentively. Nothing appeared. There was some mystery there. The engineer was puzzled. "Let us pursue this exploration to the end," said he. Half an hour after they had all arrived at the southeast angle of the lake on Prospect Heights. At this point the examination of the banks of the lake was considered finished, and yet the engineer had not been able to discover how and where the waters were discharged. "There is no doubt this overflow exists," he repeated, "and since it is not visible it must go through the granite cliff at the west." "But what importance do you attach to knowing that, my dear Cyrus?" asked Gideon Spilett. "Considerable importance," replied the engineer, "for if it flows through the cliff there is probably some cavity which it would be easy to render habitable after turning away the water." "But is it not possible, Captain, that the water flows away at the bottom of the lake," said Herbert, "and that it reaches the sea by some subterranean passage?" "That may be," replied the engineer, "and should it be so we shall be obliged to build our house ourselves, since nature has not done it for us." The colonists were about to begin to traverse the plateau to return to the Chimneys, when Top gave new signs of agitation. He barked with fury, and before his master could restrain him, he had plunged a second time into the lake. All ran towards the bank. The dog was already more than 20 feet off, and Cyrus was calling him back, when an enormous head emerged from the water, which did not appear to be deep in that place. Herbert recognized directly the species of amphibian to which the tapering head, with large eyes and adorned with long silky mustaches, belonged. "A lamantine," he cried. It was not a lamantine, but one of that species of the order of cetaceans which bear the name of the dugong, for its nostrils were open at the upper part of its snout. The enormous animal rushed on the dog, who tried to escape by returning towards the shore. His master could do nothing to save him, and before Gideon Spilett or Herbert thought of bending their bows, Top, seized by the dugong, had disappeared beneath the water. Neb, his iron-tipped spear in his hand, wished to go to Top's help and attack the dangerous animal in its own element. "No, Neb," said the engineer, restraining his courageous servant. Meanwhile, a struggle was going on beneath the water, an inexplicable struggle, for in his situation Top could not possibly resist, and judging by the bubbling of the surface it must be also a terrible struggle, and could not but terminate in the death of the dog. But suddenly, in the middle of a foaming circle, Top reappeared. Thrown in the air by some unknown power, he rose 10 feet above the surface of the lake, fell again into the amid of the agitated waters, and then soon gained the shore without any severe wounds, miraculously saved. Cyrus Harding and his companions could not understand it. What was not less inexplicable was that the struggle still appeared to be going on. Doubtless, the dugong, attacked by some powerful animal, after having released the dog, was fighting on its own account. But it did not last long. The water became red with blood, and the body of the dugong, emerging from the sheet of scarlet which spread around, soon stranded on a little beach at the south angle of the lake. The colonists ran towards it. The dugong was dead. It was an enormous animal, 15 or 16 feet long, and must have weighed from 3 to 4,000 pounds. Its neck was a wound, which appeared to have been produced by a sharp blade. What could the amphibious creature have been who, by this terrible blow, had destroyed the formidable dugong? Chapter 17. The next day, the 7th of May, Harding and Gideon Spilett, leaving Neptune, prepare breakfast, climbed Prospect Heights, while Herbert and Pencroft ascended by the river to renew their store of wood. The engineer and the reporter soon reached the little beach on which the dugong had been stranded. Already flocks of birds had attacked the mass of flesh and had to be driven away with stones, for Cyrus wished to keep the fat for the use of the colony. As to the animal's flesh, it would furnish excellent food, for in the islands of the Malay archipelago and elsewhere, it is especially reserved for the table of the native princes. But that was Neb's affair. At this moment Cyrus Harding had other thoughts. He was much interested in the incident of the day before. He wished to penetrate the mystery of that submarine combat and to ascertain what monster could have given the dugong so strange a wound. He remained at the edge of the lake, looking, observing, but nothing appeared under the tranquil waters, which sparkled in the first rays of the rising sun. At the beach, on which lay the body of the dugong, the water was tolerably shallow, but from this point the bottom of the lake sloped gradually, and it was probable that the depth was considerable. In the center, the lake may be considered as a large center basin, which was filled by the water from the Red Creek. "Well, Cyrus," said the reporter, "there seems to be nothing suspicious in this water." "No, my dear Spilett," replied the engineer, "and I really do not know how to account for the incident of yesterday." "I acknowledge," returned Spilett, "that the wound given this creature is at least very strange, and I cannot explain either how Top was so vigorously cast up out of the water. One could have thought that a powerful arm hurled him up, and that the same arm with a dagger killed the dugong." "Yes," replied the engineer, who had become thoughtful, "there is something there that I cannot understand. But do you better understand, either, my dear Spilett, in what way I was saved myself, how I was drawn from the waves and carried to the downs? No, is it not true? Now, I feel sure that there is some mystery there, which, doubtless, we shall discover some day. Let us observe, but do not dwell on these singular incidents before our companions. Let us keep our remarks to ourselves and continue our work." It will be remembered that the engineer had not as yet been able to discover the place where the surplus water escaped, but he knew it must exist somewhere. He was much surprised to see the strong current at this place. By throwing in some bits of wood he found that it set towards the southern angle. He followed the current and arrived at the south point of the lake. There was a sort of depression in the water, as if it was suddenly lost in some fissure in the ground. Harding listened. Placing his ear to the level of the lake, he very distinctly heard the noise of a subterranean fall. "There," said he, rising, "is the discharge of the water. There, doubtless, by a passage in the granite cliff, it joins the sea, through cavities which we can use to our profit. Well, I can find it." The engineer cut a long branch, stripped it of its leaves, and plunging it into the angle between the two banks, he found that there was a large hole 1 foot only beneath the surface of the water. This hole was the opening so long looked for in vain, and the force of the current was such that the branch was torn from the engineer's hands and disappeared. "There is no doubt about it now," repeated Harding. "There is the outlet, and I will lay it open to view." "How?" asked Gideon Spilett. "By lowering the level of the water of the lake 3 feet." "And how will you lower the level?" "By opening another outlet larger than this." "At what place, Cyrus?" "At the part of the bank nearest the coast." "But it is a mass of granite," observed Spilett. "Well," replied Cyrus Harding, "I will blow up the granite, and the water escaping will subside so as to lay bare this opening, and make a waterfall by falling onto the beach," added the reporter. "A fall that we shall make use of," replied Cyrus. "Come, come." The engineer hurried away his companion, whose confidence in Harding was such that he did not doubt the enterprise would succeed. And yet, how was this granite wall to be opened without powder and with imperfect instruments? Was not this work upon which the engineer was so bent above their strength? When Harding and the reporter entered the Chimneys, they found Herbert and Pencroft unloading their raft of wood. "The woodmen have just finished, Captain," said the sailor, laughing. "And when you want masons." "Masons, no, but chemists," replied the engineer. "Yes," added the reporter, "we are going to blow up the island." "Blow up the island?" cried Pencroft. "Part of it, at least," replied Spilett. "Listen to me, my friends," said the engineer, and he made known to them the result of his observations. According to him, a cavity, more or less considerable, must exist in the mass of granite which supported Prospect Heights, and he intended to penetrate into it. To do this, the opening through which the water rushed must first be cleared, and the level lowered by making a larger outlet. Therefore an explosive substance must be manufactured, which would make a deep trench in some other part of the shore. This was what Harding was going to attempt with the minerals which nature placed at his disposal. It is useless to say with what enthusiasm all, especially Pencroft, received this project. To employ great means, open the granite, create a cascade that suited the sailor, and he would just as soon be a chemist as a mason or bootmaker, since the engineer wanted chemicals. He would be all that they liked, evening a professor of dancing and deportment, said he to Neb, if that was ever necessary. Neb and Pencroft were first of all told to extract the grease from the dugong, and to keep the flesh, which was destined for food. Such perfect confidence had they in the engineer that they set out directly, without even asking a question. A few minutes after them, Cyrus Harding, Herbert, and Gideon Spilett, dragging the hurdle, went towards the vein of coals where those schistose pyrites abound which are met with in the most recent transition soil, and of which Harding had already found a specimen, all the day being employed in carrying a quantity of these stones to the Chimneys. By evening they had several tons. The next day, the 8th of May, the engineer began his manipulations. These schistose pyrites being composed principally of coal, flint, alumina, and sulphuret of iron, the latter in excess, it was necessary to separate the sulphuret of iron and transform it into sulfate as rapidly as possible. The sulfate obtained, the sulfuric acid could then be extracted. This was the object to be attained. Sulfuric acid is one of the agents the most frequently employed, and the manufacturing importance of a nation can be measured by the consumption which is made of it. This acid would later be of great use to the settlers in the manufacturing of candles, tanning skins, etc., but this time the engineer reserved it for another use. Cyrus Harding chose, behind the Chimneys, a site where the ground was perfectly level. On this ground he placed a layer of branches and chopped wood, on which were piled some pieces of schistose pyrites, buttressed one against the other, the whole being covered with a thin layer of pyrites, previously reduced to the size of a nut. This done, they set fire to the wood. The heat was communicated to the schist, which soon kindled, since it contains coal and sulfur. Then new layers of bruised pyrites were arranged so as to form an immense heap, the exterior of which was covered with earth and grass, several air holes being left, as if it was a stack of wood which was to be carbonized to make charcoal. They then left the transformation to complete itself, and it would not take less than 10 or 12 days for the sulphuret of iron to be changed to sulfate of iron and the alumina into sulfate of alumina, two equally soluble substances, the others flint, burnt coal, and cinders. Not being so, while this chemical work was going on, Cyrus Harding proceeded with other operations which were pursued with more than zeal. It was eagerness. Neb and Pencroft had taken away the fat from the dugong and placed it in large earthen pots. It was then necessary to separate the glycerine from the fat by saponifying it. Now, to obtain this result, it had to be treated either with soda or lime. In fact, one or other of these substances, after having attacked the fat, would form a soap by separating the glycerine, and it was just this glycerine which the engineer wished to obtain. There was no want of lime, only treatment by lime would give calcareous soap insoluble and consequently useless, while treatment by soda would furnish, on the contrary, a soluble soap which could be put to domestic use. Now, a practical man, like Cyrus Harding, would rather try to obtain soda. Was this difficult? No, for marine plants abounded on the shore, glasswort, ficoides, and all those fucaceae which form wrack. A large quantity of these plants was collected, first dried, then burnt in holes in the open air. The combustion of these plants was kept up for several days, and the result was a compact gray mass, which has been long known under the name of natural soda. This obtained, the engineer treated the fat with soda, which gave both a soluble soap and that neutral substance, glycerine. But this was not all. Cyrus Harding still needed, in view of his future preparation, another substance, nitrate of potash, which is better known under the name of salt niter or of saltpeter. Cyrus Harding could have manufactured this substance by treating the carbonate of potash, which would be easily extracted from the cinders of the vegetables by azotic acid. But this acid was wanting, and he would have been in some difficulty if nature had not happily furnished the saltpeter without giving them any other trouble than that of picking it up. Herbert found a vein of it at the foot of Mount Franklin, and they had nothing to do but purify this salt. These different works lasted a week. They were finished before the transformation of the sulphuret into sulfate of iron had been accomplished. During the following days the settlers had time to construct a furnace of bricks of a particular arrangement to serve for the distillation of the sulfate or iron when it had been obtained. All this was finished about the 18th of May, nearly at the time when the chemical transformation terminated. Gideon Spilett, Herbert, Neb, and Pencroft, skillfully directed by the engineer, had become most clever workmen. Before all masters, necessity is the one most listened to, and who teaches the best. When the heap of pyrites had been entirely reduced by fire, the result of the operation, consisting of sulfate of iron, sulfate of alumina, flint, remains of coal, and cinders, was placed in a basinful of water. They stirred this mixture, let it settle, then decanted it, and obtained a clear liquid containing in solution sulfate of iron and sulfate of alumina, the other matters remaining solid, since they are insoluble. Lastly, this liquid being partly evaporated, crystals of sulfate of iron were deposited, and the not evaporated liquid, which contained the sulfate of alumina, was thrown away. Cyrus Harding had now at his disposal a large quantity of these sulfate of iron crystals, from which the sulfuric acid had to be extracted. The making of sulfuric acid is a very expensive manufacture. Considerable works are necessary, a special set of tools, an apparatus of platina, leaden chambers unassailable by the acid and in which the transformation is performed, etc. The engineer had none of these at his disposal. but he knew that, in Bohemia especially, sulfuric acid is manufactured by very simple means, which have also the advantage of producing it to a superior degree of concentration. It is thus that the acid known under the name of Nordhausen acid is made. To obtain sulfuric acid, Cyrus Harding had only one operation to make: to calcine the sulfate of iron crystals in a closed vase, so that the sulfuric acid should distill in vapor, which vapor, by condensation, would produce the acid. The crystals were placed in pots, and the heat from the furnace would distill the sulfuric acid. The operation was successfully completed, and on the 20th of May, 12 days after commencing it, the engineer was the possessor of the agent which later he hoped to use in so many different ways. Now, why did he wish for this agent? Simply to produce azotic acid, and that was easy, since saltpeter, attacked by sulfuric acid, gives azotic or nitric acid by distillation. But, after all, how was he going to employ this azotic acid? His companions were still ignorant of this, for he had not informed them of the result at which he aimed. However, the engineer had nearly accomplished his purpose, and by a last operation he would procure the substance which had given so much trouble. Taking some azotic acid, he mixed it with glycerine, which had been previously concentrated by evaporation, subjected to the water bath, and he obtained, without even employing a refrigerant mixture, several pints of an oily yellow mixture. This last operation Cyrus Harding had made alone, in a retired place, at a distance from the chimneys, for he feared the danger of an explosion, and when he showed a bottle of this liquid to his friends, he contented himself with saying, "Here is nitroglycerine." It was really this terrible production, of which the explosive power is perhaps tenfold that of ordinary powder, and which has already caused so many accidents. However, since a way has been found to transform it into dynamite, that is to say, to mix with it some solid substance, clay or sugar, porous enough to hold it, the dangerous liquid has been used with some security. But dynamite was not yet known at the time when the settlers worked on Lincoln Island. "And is it that liquid that is going to blow up our rocks?" said Pencroft incredulously. "Yes, my friend," replied the engineer, "and this nitroglycerine will produce so much the more effect as the granite is extremely hard and will oppose a greater resistance to the explosion." "And when shall we see this, Captain?" "To-morrow, as soon as we have dug a hole for the mine," replied the engineer. The next day, the 21st of May, at daybreak, the miners went to the point which formed the eastern shore of Lake Grant, and was only 500 feet from the coast. At this place, the plateau inclined downwards from the waters, which were only restrained by their granite case. Therefore, if this case was broken, the water would escape by the opening and form a stream, which, flowing over the inclined surface of the plateau, would rush onto the beach. Consequently, the level of the lake would be greatly lowered, and the opening where the water escaped would be exposed, which was their final aim. Under the engineer's directions, Pencroft, armed with a pickaxe which he handled skillfully and vigorously, attacked the granite. The hole was made on the point of the shore, slanting, so that it should meet a much lower level than that of the water of the lake. In this way the explosive force, by scattering the rock, would open a large place for the water to rush out. The work took some time, for the engineer, wishing to produce a great effect, intended to devote not less than 7 quarts of nitroglycerine to the operation, but Pencroft, relieved by Neb, did so well that, towards 4 o'clock in the evening, the mine was finished. Now the question of setting fire to the explosive substance was raised. Generally, nitroglycerine is ignited by caps of fulminate, which in bursting cause the explosion. A shock is therefore needed to produce the explosion, for, simply lighted, this substance would burn without exploding. Cyrus Harding could certainly have fabricated a percussion cap. In default of fulminate, he could easily obtain a substance similar to gunquetin, since he had azotic acid at his disposal. This substance, pressed in a cartridge and introduced among the nitroglycerine, would burst by means of a fuse and cause the explosion. But Cyrus Harding knew that nitroglycerine would explode by a shock. He resolved to employ this means and try another way if this did not succeed. In fact, the blow of a hammer on a few drops of nitroglycerine, spread out on a hard surface, was enough to create an explosion. But the operator could not be there to give the blow without becoming a victim to the operation. Harding, therefore, thought of suspending a mass of iron weighing several pounds by means of a fiber to an upright just above the mine. Another long fiber, previously impregnated with sulfur, was attached to the middle of the first by one end, while the other lay on the ground several feet distant from the mine. The second fiber being set on fire, it would burn till it reached the first. This catching fire in its turn would break, and the mass of iron would fall on the nitroglycerine. This apparatus being then arranged, the engineer, after having sent his companions to a distance, filled the hole so that the nitroglycerine was on a level with the opening. Then he threw a few drops of it on the surface of the rock, above which the mass of iron was already suspended. This done, Harding lit the end of the sulfured fiber, and leaving the place, he returned with his companions to the chimneys. The fiber was intended to burn 25 minutes, and, in fact, 25 minutes afterwards a most tremendous explosion was heard. The island appeared to tremble to its very foundation. Stones were projected in the air as if by the eruption of a volcano. The shock produced by the displacing of the air was such that the rocks of the chimneys shook. The settlers, although they were more than 2 miles from the mine, were thrown on the ground. They rose, climbed the plateau, and ran towards the place where the bank of the lake must have been shattered by the explosion. A cheer escaped them. A large rent was seen in the granite.